the most famous dark hero on Earth, was invented over a single weekend by two young men in a small New York apartment, one who became rich and famous, and one who died with almost no one knowing his name. Tonight, by the fire, I am going to tell you the whole true story from the very first pencil stroke to the night. 76 years later, when the world finally set things right, okay? And I promise you, every strange and beautiful thing in this story actually happened. So settle in, little dreamer. Pull the blanket up to your chin. Let your shoulders sink into the mattress, okay? And let your breathing find its slow evening rhythm, because this story is long on purpose. It is built like a winter night with many hours in it, and you are allowed to fall asleep anywhere inside it. Nothing here will startle you, okay? Nothing here needs you to stay awake. We're going to travel through two worlds tonight, walking them side by side. One is a real world of ink-stained fingers and 10-cent magazines, of Senate hearings and summer blockbusters, of quiet men at typewriters. The other is an imagined world of rain and rooftops and gargoyles, a city that never quite sees the sun. The wonderful secret, the one I will keep proving to you all night long, is that the two worlds made each other. And through it all, I want you to keep one figure in the corner of your eye, a soft-spoken writer in eyeglasses, careful with words, generous with ideas, unlucky in almost everything else. The world forgot him for most of a century. We are not going to forget him for a single chapter. The fire is lit. The story begins a very long time ago, in a country that was afraid of the dark. Here is a question to hold gently as you get comfortable. Why would millions of people, in the middle of the hardest decade of their lives, fall in love with a man dressed as a bat? The answer begins about 10 years before he existed, so that is where we will begin too. Picture the United States in the 1920s and 30s, and picture it the way a storyteller would. The cities had grown tall, almost overnight, taller than any cities in human history. The people who lived in them were still learning what it felt like to be small at the bottom of all that stone. Elevated trains rattled past bedroom windows. Steam rose out of the streets like the ground itself was breathing. Then, in the autumn of 1929, the money failed. The stock market crashed, and the Great Depression settled over the country like a long, gray weather system that refused to move on. By the early 1930s, roughly 1 out of every 4 working people had no work at all. Families doubled up in apartments. Men in good coats sold apples on street corners because the coats were the only good thing they had left. And with the hard times came the fear of crime. This was the era of bank robbers with famous names, of bootleggers and mob wars, of tabloid newspapers that printed the darkness in big black letters every single morning. Whether the streets were truly more dangerous or simply felt that way hardly mattered. Fear had moved into the American city like a tenant who paid rent on time and never left. Now, here is the first piece of bedtime wisdom in our story, and it is one you already know from being a child once. When people are frightened of the dark, they do not usually get rid of the dark. They invent a light to hold against it. A candle, a nightlight. A story, okay? In the 1930s, being frightened on a national scale, invented stories on a national scale. Cape ones, wonderful ones, printed on paper, so rough and inexpensive that everyone simply called them the pulps. For a dime, a tired person could buy a magazine full of heroes, and for an evening, the fear had somewhere to go. The radio did the same work in sound. Picture the ritual, because it was practiced in millions of homes on the same evenings at the same hours. The family gathered around a wooden cabinet the size of a small refrigerator, the dial glowing amber. The day's worries set down on the arms of chairs, while detectives and cowboys and shadows poured out of the speaker into the dark room. Radio drama was, when you think about it, bedtime storytelling scaled up to a whole civilization. Voices in the dark telling a frightened country that the mystery would be solved by the top of the hour. People fell asleep to it, children especially, the cereals washing over them from the next room. What we are doing together right now feels ancient and familiar. That is because it is. You are lying where the 1930s lay. Only the cabinet has changed. Our hero has many grandparents living in those pulps and in the books and films around them. And I want to introduce them to you one at a time, slowly, like portraits in a long hallway. There is no rush. Hallways like this one are meant to be walked at night. The oldest portrait is a thin man in London with a magnifying glass. Sherlock Holmes had been solving mysteries in print since the 1880s, and he taught the world something radical, that a sharp mind could be a superpower. No magic, no muscles beyond the ordinary. Just observation, deduction, and the stubborn refusal to let a mystery stay mysterious. Remember him? Our hero will be called the world's greatest detective one day, and this is where that title comes from. The next portrait is a man in black with a sword, from the year 1919. A pulp writer named Johnston McCulley invented a hero for old Spanish California, a wealthy, foppish young nobleman who pretended to be lazy and harmless by day, rode out at night in a mask and cape to defend the powerless. He was called Zorro, the Fox. And in him, fully formed, is one of the great ideas our story will borrow. The rich man whose softness is a costume and whose true self only comes out after dark. Beside him hangs a shadow, literally a shadow, key in 1930 and 1931. Radio and pulp magazines gave America a frightening avenger called the Shadow, a figure in a black cloak and slouch hat. He knew what evil lurked in the hearts of men and who terrified criminals half to death before he ever touched them. He was not gentle. He was not colorful. He proved that a hero could be scary, that fear itself could be turned around and pointed at the people who caused it. There are more portraits in the hallway. Doc Savage, the perfect man of the pulps, with his gadgets and his brilliant mind and his secret Arctic retreat, a hideaway that would one day inspire another hero's fortress. The Phantom, who arrived in newspapers in 1936, wearing the first skin-tight costume in hero history, with a mask that had blank white eyes because his artist thought it looked more mysterious. Keep those blank white eyes in mind. You have seen them somewhere before. And then the hallway darkens a little, pleasantly, the way a room darkens when a film begins, because the movies of those years were teaching audiences to love the Gothic. In 1931, a Hungarian actor named Bela Lugosi swept a cape across American screens as Dracula. And suddenly, the image of a caped figure with the qualities of a bat was burned into the popular imagination. A year earlier, a crime film called The Bat Whispers had put a bat-costumed figure on screen, complete with a bat signal of sorts flashed against a wall. The young artist at the center of our next chapter watched films like these, and he remembered them. One more portrait, and this one is my favorite because it is 400 years older than everything else in the hallway. In the 1400s, in Italy, Leonardo da Vinci filled his notebooks with sketches of flying machines, including a winged contraption called an ornithopter, its wings ribbed and scalloped like a bat's. Leonardo never saw it fly. He folded his drawings away, and they waited. They waited through centuries, through empires, through the invention of the printing press and the light bulb and the comic book, until a 19-year-old in the Bronx would open a book of those sketches and feel something click. I love that detail, and I want to slow down inside it for a moment, because it is the kind of true thing that feels like a fairy tale. An idea can wait 400 years for the right person. Nothing good is ever really wasted. Some seeds simply have very long winters. So there is the world before the bat, a frightened country, a hallway full of ancestors, a public that had learned to love masked men, dark capes, brilliant detectives, and the peculiar comfort of being safely scared. Every ingredient was on the table. All that was missing was the recipe. And the recipe was about to arrive from the most unlikely direction imaginable. Two teenagers from Cleveland, Ohio, and a flying man in a red cape. But that is the next chapter, and we have all night. For now, breathe with me for a moment. In, slow, and easy. Out, a little longer. The people in this chapter, the frightened millions of the 1930s. They made it through their long night, and one of the ways they made it through was by telling stories at bedtime, in barbershops, in kitchens, in dime magazines. Fear is oldest at night. So are the stories we invented to hold it. You are holding one right now, and it is holding you back. Let your eyes rest. The hallway of portraits will keep, and somewhere ahead of us, in the spring of 1938, a printing press is warming up. Every great fire in history began with a spark that looked like nothing. Ours looked like this. Two shy teenagers in Cleveland, Ohio. A writer named Jerry Siegel and an artist named Joe Shuster, lying awake at night in the early 1930s, dreaming up a character nobody wanted. They were the sons of Jewish immigrants, boys who loved science fiction magazines and did not quite fit in at school. And together they invented a man who could not be hurt. A strong man from a doomed faraway world, raised kindly in the American heartland, who wore his underwear on the outside and caught falling people out of the sky. They spent years mailing him to publishers. His publishers spent years mailing him back. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it is one of the most soothing, true facts I know. The single most successful character idea of the 20th century was rejected over and over, for years, by nearly everyone who saw it. Whatever you are waiting on, whatever door has not opened yet, you are in extremely good company. The door finally opened almost by accident. A struggling publishing company in New York, one of several tangled little firms that would eventually braid together into the company we now call DC, needed material to fill a brand new magazine. It was cheaper to buy the strange strong man than to commission something better. So in June of 1938, a comic magazine called Action Comics, issue number 1, arrived on American newsstands with a price of 10 cents and a cover that made no sense at all. A man in a red cape lifting a car over his head while grown men fled in terror. The publishers reportedly hated that cover. They thought it was ridiculous. Damn, the sales figures came back. Action Comics did not just sell. It sold out and kept selling out, month after month, until the magazine was moving close to 1 million copies an issue, at a time when the whole country had well under 150 million people in it. Children mobbed newsstands asking, specifically, for the magazine with the flying man. The character's name, of course, was Superman, and in the space of about a year, he went from a rejected idea in a Cleveland bedroom to the center of an entirely new industry. And now I have to tell you what the two boys from Cleveland were paid, because it belongs in this story, like a tuning note belongs at the start of a symphony. For the rights to Superman, for the whole character, forever, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster received a check for $130, $10 a page for the 13 pages of that first story. Standard freelance rates. Sign here. They stayed on salary drawing and writing him for years. And they were paid well enough for a while, but the character himself, the idea, empire of radio shows and cartoons and cereal boxes already assembling itself, belonged entirely to the publisher. And when the boys sued to get him back in the late 1940s, they lost and were let go and drifted for decades into obscurity and genuine poverty. Shuster's eyesight failing, Siegel working as a mail clerk while his creations' films were announced in the trade papers. Their story, I promise, also bends toward light decades later. In 1975, when an aging Siegel wrote a furious, open letter, and fellow artists took up the cause, and the corporation, embarrassed on the eve of a huge Superman film, granted the two old men pensions and, crucially, their names, created by, restored to every printing forever after. Hold the shape of that story in your hand for a moment. Feel its weight, and now set it down gently beside our own, because you can already see it, can't you, young creators, a work for a higher century, a company that keeps the gold, a name that goes missing, and a very long road back. What happened to the fathers of the daylight hero is about to happen in a quieter key and over an even longer road to the quiet father of the dark one. The 1930s did this to its dreamers almost as a matter of policy. The rest of the century, at its best, spent itself making it right, because that is what happened next, and it happened at panic speed. Every publisher in New York looked at those sales numbers and asked the only question publishers ever asked, which is, how do we get one of those? The scramble was on. Offices that had been printing detective stories and jungle adventures suddenly wanted costumed heroes, as many as possible, as fast as possible. Here's the part I find genuinely funny in the gentlest way. Superheroes, this grand mythology that would one day fill museums and universities in billion-dollar films, did not multiply because of artistic vision, okay? They multiplied because of a gold rush. The hero of the night, the one we're here to talk about, exists because the hero of the day sold out at newsstands. He was born in the most literal business sense as Superman's shadow, and I mean that almost poetically. So let me slow down and say it properly, because it is one of the central ideas of our whole night together. Superman was the daylight answer to the 1930s. He was the sun. He was hope with a cape on, an immigrant fantasy of being welcomed and strong and good. A man so powerful that fear simply could not reach him. Children loved him because he made the frightening world feel light. But every sun casts shadows, and some part of a frightened public needed something else. Not a god who was above the fear, but a man who had been all the way down inside it. Someone who had lost the way people in 1939 had lost, and who had built himself back out of the wreckage. The market wanted another Superman. What it was actually waiting for, though nobody knew it yet, was his opposite. At the offices of Detective Comics, the editors put out the word to their freelancers, bring us costumed heroes. And among the freelancers who heard it was a 19-year-old artist from the Bronx, quick with a pencil, and even quicker with an opportunity, named Robert Kahn, who had smoothed his name into something he thought sounded better on a comics page. Bob Kane. Bob Kane was, by every account, a young man in a hurry. He was not the best artist in New York, and he knew it. But he had something many better artists lacked, an absolutely unembarrassed instinct for business. He heard what Superman was earning. He heard that editors were paying real money for the next big costume. And somewhere around the end of the week, he told an editor he would have something to show on Monday. It gave him one weekend in the early months of 1939 to invent a legend. And here, I have to be honest with you, because this is a true story, and true stories are honest, just like our last one was. What Bob Kane came up with alone over that weekend was not a legend. He sketched a hero he called the Batman, and this first draft wore a bright red Union suit, a small black domino mask like a masquerade guest, and a pair of stiff wings jutting off his back. Copied lovingly from Leonardo da Vinci's 400-year-old ornithopter. He had blonde hair. He looked, if we are being kind, like Superman on his way to a costume party. The wings were the Da Vinci sketch made flesh, and that part was genuinely lovely, the long-buried seed finally sprouting. But the rest was not there yet, and Bob Kane, to his credit, seems to have sensed that it was not there yet, because before he took his drawing to the editors, he called a friend to come look at it. The friend's name was Bill Finger, and I am going to leave him right there, standing in the doorway of Bob Kane's apartment with his hat in his hand, because he deserves a chapter of his own, and he is finally about to get one 87 years late. Breathe with me before we go to him. In, slow, through the nose, out, long, like a sigh you have been saving all day. Think about those two boys in Cleveland, mailing their flying man out into a world that kept saying no. And think about how the whole shining mythology of the 20th century grew out of their stubbornness. Then think about a red Union suit and stiff wooden wings. An idea that was almost right, waiting overnight for the one person who could finish it. Almost right is a fine place to fall asleep, but the finishing touches are coming. Now we come to the heart of the matter, the small, quiet room where the whole legend was actually born. And I want to tell this part slowly, because it deserves slowness. Two young men, one lamp, one drawing on the table between them. Hold that image. Everything else in our long night tonight grows out of it. Bill Finger was 25 years old in the early months of 1939, and life had already asked him to shrink his dreams once. He had wanted to be a writer, a real one, but the Depression had other plans, and so he was selling shoes to keep the lights on. Writing when he could, carrying a little notebook where he collected ideas the way other men collected coins. People who knew him described the same person over and over across decades. Soft-spoken, meticulous, generous with ideas, terrible at fighting for himself. He was the kind of man who would give you the best thing he had and then apologize for the wrapping. He and Bob Kane had met at a party and struck up a working friendship. Kane drawing, Finger ghostwriting, Finger's name appearing nowhere, which was common enough in those days and did not seem, yet, like the beginning of a tragedy. When Kane needed help over that fateful weekend, Finger was the natural call. Came over. Hey. He looked at the red union suit, the domino mask, the stiff Da Vinci wings, the blonde hair. Hey. And then, gently, the way he did everything, Bill Finger began to change the world. The bright red suit, he suggested, should go. A creature of the night should wear the colors of the night, gray and black and deep blue black, so that he could melt into shadow the way a bat melts into a dusk sky. The stiff, mechanical wings should become a cape, but not an ordinary cape. Finger reportedly pointed to the edge of the drawing and suggested the cape be scalloped, cut into points along the bottom, so that when the hero moved, the cape itself would look like a bat's wings unfolding. The little domino masks should become a full cowl, covering the whole head, with two pointed ears rising off it like a bat's. And the eyes, Finger said, should be blank. No pupils, no whites of the eyes, just empty white slits, so that criminals looking at him would see nothing human looking back. That single suggestion, those blank white eyes, borrowed from the visual language of heroes like the Phantom, may be the most quietly brilliant design decision in the history of the medium. It made a man in a costume into a creature, under Finger's pencilless hands, using nothing but words. The drawing on the table transformed. The blonde hair vanished under the cowl. The gaudy red became midnight. What had walked into that weekend as a costume party Superman walked out as something genuinely new, elegant, frightening, and strange. A silhouette that a child could draw in 3 lines and a grown-up could fear in the dark. But Finger was not done, because Finger was a writer, and writers know that a costume is not a character. A character is a wound, a wish, and a rule. So he kept going, asking the questions that turned the sketch into a soul. Who was the man inside the suit? Finger reached for the name of a Revolutionary War hero, Mad Anthony Wayne, and for the smooth society sound of names like Bruce, and put them together. A wealthy young man about town, charming and seemingly idle, whose softness would be the disguise and whose darkness would be the truth. The old Zorro architecture, rebuilt in an American city. In what city? Not a real one, Finger decided, because a real city would pin the stories down. He wanted somewhere that could be every dark city at once. Flipping through a New York City phone book, the story goes, his eye caught on the name of a jewelry business, and he had it. Gotham. We will spend a whole chapter later tonight inside that name, because its true history is a bedtime story all by itself. But for now, just notice what happened. In one weekend, a shoe salesman named the man, dressed the man, and built the man a city. Detective Comics bought the character almost immediately. And now comes the turn in the story, the quiet click of a lock. The moment I asked you at the very beginning of the night, to watch for. Bob Kane's father worked in the printing business and knew his way around agreements, and Bob, ambitious and sharp, went into the negotiations well advised. The deal he signed with the publisher was, by the standards of young freelancers in 1939, extraordinary. It gave Bob Kane ownership stakes, ongoing payments, and one clause that would echo for 76 years. A guarantee that every single appearance of the character forever would carry one credit and one credit only. It's created by Bob Kane. Bill Finger was not in the room. Bill Finger was not in the contract. Bill Finger was not, as far as the world would be told, for most of a century, anywhere at all. He went on writing the stories, of course, hundreds of them, as a ghost, paid by the page, while the character he had shaped in a weekend grew into one of the most valuable ideas on earth. Kane would spend decades taking sole credit. Sometimes graciously, sometimes not, and Finger would spend those same decades quietly telling the truth at the occasional convention panel. In his soft voice, 2 small rooms, and being quietly not believed, because the printed page said otherwise, and the printed page said Bob Kane. I am not telling you this part to make you sad before sleep. I promise there is a reason, and the reason is that this story has an ending, a genuinely good one. And it is waiting for us in the last hour of our night, like a light left on at the end of a hallway. But a light only means something if you have walked the dark hallway first. So we will carry Bill Finger with us from here on, chapter by chapter, the quiet man in the corner of every scene. For now, though, let us end the chapter where it began, because the image is too good to leave. A small apartment in New York City, early 1939. A lamp, a table, 2 young men leaning over a drawing, one talking softly, one erasing and redrawing. Neither of them having any idea, not the faintest flicker of an idea, that they were building something that would outlive them both. And their children, and quite possibly their children's children. Some of the most important work in the world is done exactly like that. Quietly, at a table, at night, by people whose names we never learn. Tonight, at least, we have learned one. Say it once in your mind, softly, like putting a book back on a shelf. Bill Finger. Now, let it go, and let your breathing go slow and deep. The drawing is finished. The contract is signed, for better and for worse, since somewhere in the spring of 1939, a printing press is about to introduce the world to a bat. In May of 1939, a magazine called Detective Comics, issue number 27, appeared on American newsstands for 10 cents. With a cover showing a caped figure swinging over a city rooftop on a rope, a criminal locked under one arm. A cover promised, in excited yellow letters, the amazing and unique adventures of the Batman. Inside, the debut story ran just 6 pages. 6 pages. I want you to feel how small that is, as a character who would one day carry 10,000 comics, dozens of films, entire theme park lands, and roughly a century of the world's imagination. Arrived in a story shorter than a homework assignment. I will tell you what happens in those 6 pages, the way you would tell it across a pillow in broad, soft strokes, because the shape matters more than the details. There is a string of wealthy men being murdered, one by one, over a crooked business scheme. There is a police commissioner, already named Gordon, puzzling over it. There is his idle, wealthy young friend, who seems barely interested, and there is a shadow that keeps arriving where the killers are, a silent figure in gray and black who solves what the police cannot, and who turns out, in the final panels, little wink to the reader, to be the bored young friend all along. That is it. That is the whole beginning. Okay? Detective story, wearing a horror costume. Okay? And that combination, right there in the first 6 pages, is the secret of why it worked. Okay? The pulps had scary Avengers, and the bookshelves had brilliant detectives. Okay? But here they were fused. A mystery you could follow with your mind, and a creature you could feel in your spine. The head and the heart of the frightened 1930s, stapled together for a dime. And let me paint the world that 10 cents lived in, because it explains everything about what those magazines became. A dime in 1939 was real money to a child, a week's careful saving, or a hard-won errand fee, and a comic book was therefore never a private possession for long. It was currency. Comics were traded, loaned, rented out by enterprising kids at 2 cents a read. Passed down rows of desks, inside geography textbooks, rolled into back pockets, read on stoops until the covers hung by one staple. A single copy might pass through 30 pairs of hands. And then came the war, and with it, the great paper drives, patriotic collection campaigns in which America's children were urged to donate their old comics and magazines by the wagon load to be pulped for the war effort. And they did, by the uncountable million. Which is why, and now the auction prices make sense, almost none of them survived. Print runs in the hundreds of thousands were read to shreds and then pulped for victory. And the handful of copies of Detective Comics issue 27 that came through, the ones some quiet child tucked into a drawer and some patient family never threw out, are rare the way things touched by history are rare. The readers felt it immediately. Back then, at the newsstand, sales climbed, then climbed again, and within a year, the character had earned his own solo title, which almost no one got. And, decades later, the world would put a number on what that first appearance meant. Surviving copies of Detective Comics issue 27, the ones kept dry and unbent through 80-odd years, have reportedly sold at auction for more than $1.5 million each, a 10-cent magazine, worth more than a mansion. Somewhere tonight, a handful of them are sleeping in vaults, wrapped like relics, which in a way is exactly what they are. But here's the thing I find most beautiful about the 2 years that followed, and it is the real subject of this chapter. The character who debuted in issue 27 was barely a character at all. He had no history, no butler, no cave, no vow. All of that, the entire cathedral of the mythology, was built piece by piece, issue by issue. Mostly by Bill Finger and the artists working alongside Kane for the next 24 months, like a coral reef assembling itself in fast motion. Let me walk you through the construction, slowly, like watching a house go up across the street over a long, pleasant year. 6 months after the debut in Detective Comics issue 33. Near the end of 1939, the builders poured the foundation, and the foundation was grief. In just 2 pages, readers finally learned why. A wealthy couple walking home from an evening out with their small son, a dark alley, a robbery gone wrong, 2 shots, and a boy kneeling on the pavement, making a candlelit promise over his parents' memory to spend the rest of his life warring on all criminals, so that no other child would ever kneel where he was kneeling. 2 pages. It remains, sentence for sentence, one of the most efficient origin stories ever written, and it changed everything. Superman was strong because of where he was born. This man would be strong because of what he had lost. Every frightened, grieving reader of 1939, and there were millions, suddenly had a hero whose power source was something they actually owned. And notice, gently, what the vow really is, because this is one of our bedtime threads, and I will pull on it all night. The vow is a rule a wounded person gives himself so that the wound will have a direction. That is all it is. Grief turned to face forward. We will come back to that. The rest of the reef grew fast. It's a great manor house on the edge of the city. It's a loyal butler who arrived a few years in as a plump comic relief figure and would, slowly, over decades, steepen into one of the warmest characters in all of fiction. It's the surrogate father who patched wounds and made cutting remarks and never once left. It's the long dark car, which readers eventually named before the writers did. The belt of tools and tricks, so that a hero with no powers could always, plausibly, have exactly one gadget left. And beneath the house, the cave. It began humbly, as barely a barn and a tunnel. It grew through the 1940s into the vast underground sanctum every child now draws by instinct. The trophy room, the laboratory, the river of bats overhead, the famous entrance through a grandfather clock, by the way, was invented not in the comics at all, but in a live-action movie serial in the 1940s, and the comics liked it so much they adopted it backward. The myth was already doing the thing great myths do, absorbing improvements from every direction and pretending it had thought of them all along. But the most important construction of those first 2 years was not a place or a gadget. It was a rule, and it was born from an editor's discomfort. Because I have to tell you honestly what the earliest stories were like. The first version of this hero was rough, carried a gun for a while. Criminals who fell off rooftops were allowed to fall. In one early story, he mounted a machine gun on his plane. He was, in those first months, very much a pulp avenger in the old shadow mold, and the shadow mold was not gentle. The editors at Detective Comics looked at their increasingly young readership, millions of children now, and made a decision that would define the character more than any costume ever could. The gun was taken away. The killing stopped permanently. And in its place grew the famous code, stated and restated across the decades until it became the character's true north. He does not kill. Not the worst of them. Not ever. Because the moment he kills, he becomes the thing that made him the gun in the alley, and the vow collapses. Editors made that rule for business reasons, to keep worried parents calm. But Bill Finger and the writers who followed turned the business rule into a soul. And here, Little Dreamer is the deepest piece of bedtime wisdom in tonight's whole story. So, I will say it slowly. The code is the character. A man with every reason in the world to become cruel, who decides every single night not to be. That is the actual superpower. Not the car, not the money, not the martial arts. The rule. And you know something about this, because you have rules like it yourself. The small promises you keep to yourself, so that your worst nights don't get to decide who you are. A person who keeps a promise to themselves in the dark is doing, at human scale, exactly what he does at mythic scale. So look at what stood completed by the end of 1940, barely 18 months after 6 little pages. The wound, the vow, the rule, the manor above, the cave below, the city all around, a butler, a commissioner, a car, a belt, the entire architecture assembled at speed by young men paid by the page, most of whom signed nothing and were credited nowhere, building a cathedral they did not know was a cathedral. Breathe here with me. In, slowly, 4 counts, if you like. Out, longer, and let the day drain off you the way rain drains off a scalloped cape. Think about the rules you keep for yourself, the quiet ones nobody sees, and be a little proud of them tonight. They are load-bearing. They are the cave under your house. And when you're ready, we will meet the ones who came to fill that house. A boy in bright colors, a grinning man, and a cat. By the spring of 1940, The Dark Knight had a problem that nobody in publishing had ever needed to solve before, because nobody had ever built a hero this dark for an audience this young. The problem was loneliness. A silent creature brooding across rooftops is a magnificent image, but he is a difficult companion. And the readers were children, and children do not want to watch a story from the street below. They want to be in it. The solution arrived in April of 1940, in Detective Comics issue 38, wearing red, yellow, and green, and it was, depending on which historian you ask, either a stroke of genius or a lightning bolt of pure commerce, probably both. The creative team gave The Dark Knight a partner, a boy. The story the writers built for him is a mirror, and the mirror is the whole point. So let me hold it up gently. A family of circus acrobats, famous for flying, performing high above a crowd. Sabotage, arranged by gangsters squeezing the circus for protection money. A fall, and afterward, a boy standing where the boy in the alley had once knelt, holding the same impossible weight. The wealthy man in the audience that night recognized the weight instantly because it was his own, and he took the boy home. Two orphans, one vow, now shared. The older one had been alone with his grief for years. The younger one would not have to be, and whatever cold-eyed sales logic sat behind the decision, the story it produced is genuinely tender, and it quietly announced the great secret theme of the entire 80-year mythology. One of our threads for the night. This is a story about a loner who cannot stop building a family. Hold that thread. It only gets warmer. The commercial logic, for the record, worked spectacularly. With The Boy Wonder aboard, sales on the title are said to have roughly doubled. Suddenly, every publisher in New York was bolting a kid sidekick onto every hero they had. An entire industry of gruff men acquiring wards at implausible speed. But ours was first, and ours meant it, and the partnership changed the hero himself in a way the writers only half intended. A man alone in the dark can curdle, give him someone to teach, someone to protect, someone to talk to on the long stackouts, and the darkness gets a window in it. Okay. The boy in bright colors was placed there for the child readers. Okay. Yes, but he ended up saving the man, and the stories have understood that ever since. Loneliness, not any villain, is the actual enemy in this mythology. It always has been. Speaking of villains, that same spring of 1940, the hero graduated to his own solo title. It's an honor almost no character earned. The very first issue of it performed a miracle that has never been repeated in the history of the medium. In one single issue, it introduced two of the most famous antagonists in all of fiction. The first was a grinning man. It's a creative circle around the character, and exactly who deserves how much credit is one of comics' longest arguments. Built him from 3 ingredients, and the ingredients are documented history. A playing card, the Joker from a standard deck, a grinning advertising face, and, most hauntingly, a silent film from 1928 called The Man Who Laughs, in which the great actor Conrad Vietti played a man whose face had been carved in childhood into a permanent smile so that he grinned through every sorrow of his life. The writers and artists saw a still photograph of Vietti in that makeup, the wide, fixed smile under sad eyes, and they knew they had their monster. He arrived in that first issue as something the funny pages had never seen. Killer who left his victims smiling, who treated murder as a punchline, whose crimes had the logic of a joke and the temperature of a nightmare. The character was reportedly meant to die almost immediately, and an editor stopped it, sensing what everyone would eventually know. You do not throw away the perfect opposite, and he is the perfect opposite. Okay. Let me set the two of them side by side on the nightstand, because the symmetry is almost too clean for real life. Okay. One is a man devoted to order, discipline, and meaning, whose whole existence is a vow. Okay. The other is devoted to chaos, whose whole existence is the claim that vows are hilarious, that nothing means anything, that one bad day is all it takes to turn anyone into him. One wears his tragedy as armor, Adia wears his as a grin. 80 years of writers have understood that these two are the same wound, answered 2 different ways, and that is why their argument has never once gotten boring. The second arrival in that same issue padded in on quiet feet, a jewel thief, elegant, clever, and completely unbothered by anyone's rules. Introduced simply as the Cat, who would soon acquire a costume, a whip, and a name the whole world knows. She was drawn from the era's great screen sirens, and she brought with her something the mythology badly needed. Gray, because she is not a villain, exactly. And she has spent 8 decades declining to become a hero, exactly. And the Dark Knight has spent those same 8 decades failing to file her in either drawer. She steals, but from people who mostly deserve it. She helps, but only when it suits her. Every mythology needs a figure like her, someone who proves the rules are chosen rather than automatic. She is the proof, and the gallery kept filling fast through the early 1940s. So let me walk you down the row of cells, slowly, nodding at each arrival. Because almost every legend was seated within 4 years of the debut. Most of them with Bill Finger's fingerprints somewhere on the paperwork. 1941 brought the Scarecrow, a gaunt professor of psychology, humiliated all his life for his looks and his obsessions, who weaponized the very subject he taught, brewing fear itself into a gas and puffing it into the faces of a city. He is the most on-the-nose mirror in the whole gallery, and I mean that as praise. The hero uses fear as a tool against the guilty, and the Scarecrow uses it as a toy against the innocent. In every story they share is secretly an essay about the difference. He was crime wearing a bow tie, corruption with impeccable table manners. The reminder that Gotham's rot did not all live in alleys. Some of it had reservations at the best restaurant in town. 1942 delivered the saddest cell in the row. Harvey Dent was written as the hero's friend. That is the wound of it, the crusading. Movie star handsome district attorney fighting the same war by daylight, in a suit and tie, with a lucky two-headed silver dollar from his father in his pocket. He is duality itself, of course, the double life theme carved into a single body. But the older sorrow underneath is about luck, about how one bad instinct can bisect a life, and the hero has never stopped trying to save him, because saving Harvey would mean the coin can land good side up for anyone, even after everything. In 1948, completed the classic row with the Riddler, a green-suited, compulsive in a domino mask who simply could not commit a crime without mailing in a clue first, a man pathologically incapable of being unwitnessed. He looked like the silliest of the lot and is secretly one of the deepest, because he is the mirror of the detective's own mind. The intellect that must be seen being clever, puzzle of, curdled into a scream for attention. Every riddle he leaves is really the same question, which is, am I the smartest person in this city? And the tragedy is that the answer arrives every single time, swinging in through the window. So step back with me and look at what a few short years accomplished. 1940 gave the mythology its heart in a boy who shared the vow. It gave the mythology its shadow in a clown who mocked the vow. It gave the mythology its temptation in a cat who lived gorgeously outside the vow altogether. And seasons just after filled the row of mirrors, fear, corruption, chance, and pride, each in its cell, each with its face. The reef was no longer just architecture, was populated. And here's the pattern to carry forward, our rogues gallery thread. Because every great enemy who arrives after this follows the same quiet blueprint. Each one is a piece of the hero himself, pushed past midnight, his fear given a scarecrow's face, his dual life split into a coin with two sides, his grief frozen, his discipline curdled into obsession. The gallery is not a collection of monsters. It is a hall of mirrors, and he walks it every night, and he does not kill what he sees there, because what he sees there is himself, one bad turn removed. We tell children something similar at bedtime in smaller words. Our fears wear faces so that we can look at them, and looking at a fear calmly, by lamplight, at a safe distance, watching it become almost familiar, almost silly, almost sad, is half of how human beings have always gotten to sleep. So do that now. Whatever face your own worry has been wearing today, let it sit in the chair across the room and notice that it is not doing anything. It is just sitting there, always was. Breathe in, slow, breathe out, slower. The house is full now. The boy asleep down the hall. It's the cat somewhere on the rooftops. The grinning man locked away where he belongs. And far ahead of us in the story, out in the real world of 1954, a doctor with a briefcase is walking toward a Senate hearing room, carrying a book that will nearly end everything. But he cannot get here tonight without walking through several very slow, very peaceful chapters. First, rest now. The war years are quiet ones, and they are next. The 1940s passed over Gotham like weather. and I can tell you about them in a single slow page, because they were, for our hero, mostly gentle years. The Second World War came, and comics went to war with everybody else. Covers showed the dynamic duo selling war bonds and riding eagles and smiling, always smiling now, because the country at war wanted its heroes bright. The darkness of 1939 faded like a photograph left in a sunny window. Kacher of the night became a deputized citizen, practically a scout leader in a cape, and daytime crept into the stories. A daily newspaper strip launched in 1943 and ran through the war years, putting the character on breakfast tables beside the headlines. And the radio waves borrowed him too, as an occasional guest on the wildly popular Superman radio program, where, in a detail I have always found charming, he was sometimes written in largely so the Superman voice actor could take a vacation. Even legends cover each other's shifts. Hollywood came calling as well, with 2 low-budget movie serials, 15-chapter cliffhanger adventures shown in theaters, one breathless piece at a time. The first in 1943, and the second in 1949. They were cheap and creaky and wonderful. Capes made of what looks suspiciously like drapery. Think their poverty turned out to be strangely generous, because necessity kept inventing things the comics would keep. The 1943 serial, needing a cheap home base, gave the hero an underground lair and called it, for the first time anywhere, the Bat's Cave, a name the comics promptly adopted and polished into the Batcave, which had barely existed on the page before Hollywood named it. The same serial cast a slim, mustached English actor named William Austin as the butler, at a time when the comics were still drawing Alfred plump and clean-shaven, and the comics simply redrew him to match the movies, slimming him down and giving him the mustache he has worn for 80 years since. One of the serials, almost by accident, invented the secret entrance through the grandfather clock, which the comics happily stole back as well. Nobody owns the good ideas for long. A cheap serial names The Cave. A radio show in 1945 invents an entire beloved character, the earliest version of Alfred's partner in worry, and hands him to the comics. A television cartoon in the 90s invents Harley Quinn and hands her over. The myth is a river, and everything upstream, movies, radio, cartoons, toys, even the mistakes, gets carried down and smoothed into the bed. The version you love, whichever it is, was built by 100 hands that never met. And the war ended, and the boys came home, and comic books were selling in numbers that are hard to believe now. Tens of millions of copies every single month, read by children and soldiers and grandmothers alike, which is exactly when the trouble started, because nothing that big and that beloved by children goes unexamined forever. His name was Dr. Frederick Wertham, and I want to be fair to him, because bedtime is no place for villains made of cardboard. He was a psychiatrist, German-born, genuinely accomplished, who ran a clinic in Harlem, treating troubled young people, often for free, and he had seen real suffering up close. He was not a fraud, and he was not a fool. He was something more familiar and more human than that. He was a person who found a frightening answer and stopped looking. Wertham noticed that the troubled children in his clinic read comic books. Of course they did. In 1950, virtually every child in America read comic books, the way virtually every child today watches videos. It was simply what children did. But Wertham looked at the overlap and drew a straight line through it. And in 1954, he published a book called Seduction of the Innocent, arguing that comic books were a corrupting machine, mass-producing delinquency, violence, and moral decay in the nation's young. The book named names, and among the names was our hero. The wealthy man, the young ward, the manor house. All of it was presented as unwholesome, a fantasy no child should be allowed near. Other genres took worse beatings, especially the gory horror and crime comics of the day, but nobody was spared, and the book landed on a country that was already primed to be afraid. This was 1954, the deep, cold war, the era of loyalty, oaths, and blacklists, a nation actively hunting for hidden corruptions. Parents, groups, organized. In some towns, and this is documented history, not legend, children were marched to bonfires and encouraged to throw their own comic collections into the flames. Book burnings in post-war America, fueled by dime magazines about men in capes. By April of 1954, the United States Senate itself convened hearings on comic books and juvenile delinquency, complete with television cameras and stern subcommittee faces. Publishers were summoned. One of them, the man behind the most gruesome horror line, gave testimony so disastrous it became famous. The industry saw the cliff edge clearly and did what frightened industries do. It regulated itself before the government could. The result was called the Comics Code Authority, born in the autumn of 1954, and it was one of the strictest censorship regimes ever applied to an American medium. Its stamp of approval had to appear on a comic's cover, or most stores simply would not carry it. And the rules behind that stamp were breathtaking. Crime could never be shown sympathetically. Authority figures could never be shown as corrupt. No horror, no vampires, no werewolves. Good had to triumph completely and cleanly every single time. Read that list again, slowly, and think about our hero. A vigilante who exists because the police cannot be fully trusted, who works outside the law in a city defined by corruption, whose whole aesthetic is horror borrowed from Dracula. The code did not just trim the character. Hey, it outlawed practically everything Bill Finger had built on that weekend in 1939. Dozens of publishers simply died. The industry shrank like a puddle in August. And the survivors, our hero among them, had to become something else entirely, which is the strange and rather delightful subject of the next chapter. But before we leave the doctor, the story has a twist, and it is a true one. Uncovered decades later in the quiet way truths usually are. In the 2010s, a scholar named Carol Tilly went into Wortham's own archived papers, his original case notes, and compared them with what he had published. And she found, documented in his own handwriting, that the evidence had been bent. Case studies combined, details altered, children's words shaded to fit the thesis. The book that nearly killed an American art form had cooked its data. There is a bedtime lesson folded into that, and it is gentle, so let me fold it out. Moral panics are a society having a bad dream. Something real and frightening is out there, and the sleeping mind grabs the nearest strange object and pins all the fear to it. Comic books in the 50s. Novels a century before that, when doctors warned that reading fiction would ruin young women. Radio, television, rock music, video games, each one in its turn declared the corrupter of youth, each panic burning hot, and then looking faintly silly from 30 years' distance. The fear of stories is older than almost any story we still have, and it is always, at bottom, a compliment. People only panic about things that are powerful, and stories are the most powerful things human beings make. You are lying inside one right now, letting it lower your heart rate, which is its own quiet proof. So breathe in the slow way and picture the whole panic from far above, the way history sees it. The bonfires cooled, the Senate moved on. The doctor's book gathers dust, annotated now by the scholar who checked his math. And the 10-cent hero he tried to take away from the children is still here, 80-some years on, tucking their great-grandchildren in. Stories win by outlasting. So do people. Sleep on that one. And when you are ready, I will tell you about the strangest decade this character ever lived through. The one with the rainbow suits and the dog in the little mask. What does a creature of the night do when the night itself has been outlawed? That is not a riddle. It is simply the situation our hero woke up to in 1955. With the Comics Code stamp sitting on his cover like a hall monitor, forbidding horror, forbidding moral shadow, forbidding nearly everything he was made of. And the answer the writers found is one of the funniest and most endearing detours in the whole history of fiction. a tease. They sent him to space. I am not exaggerating even slightly. And I want you to enjoy this chapter the way you would enjoy looking through a relative's most embarrassing photo album. With love. Through the middle, in late 1950s, the dark detective of Gotham City fought aliens. Right. He traveled through time to visit knights and cavemen. He was regularly transformed by rays and potions and magical mishaps into a baby, a giant, a genie, a mummy, and on one famous occasion, a rainbow-colored version of himself, wearing a different, violently bright costume every day of the week for reasons that made sense at the time. He gained a dog, Ace, who wore a little mask over his eyes to protect his secret identity, because the dog had a secret identity. He gained an imp from another dimension, tiny reality-bending superfan in a homemade costume named Batmite, who caused chaos out of pure adoration. In 1956, he gained a Batwoman, introduced in part, historians note, as a direct answer to Dr. Wortham's insinuations. A glamorous crime fighter whose utility purse contained lipstick and compacts that were secretly gadgets. The stories glowed like a jukebox. Nothing lurked. Everything zapped. And it is very easy, from where we sit, to laugh at all of it. So let me tell you why I mostly do not. Because underneath the silliness, something quietly heroic was happening. Survival. Code had made the character's true self illegal, and the atomic age had made science fiction the only game in town. With Sputniks in the headlines and flying saucers at the drive-in. The writers, many of them the same underpaid freelancers as always, Bill Finger, still ghosting among them, looked at the rules and found the only door left open, and they walked through it in a rainbow suit. Silliness was a survival strategy. The characters stayed in print, stayed on newsstands, stayed alive in the imaginations of a new generation of children, while dozens of sterner heroes from the 40s simply vanished forever. Sometimes surviving a strange season is the whole job. There is a very soft bedtime lesson in that, for anyone who has ever gotten through a hard stretch of life by being, temporarily, not quite themselves. The manor was still there. The cave was still there. They were just waiting. But survival strategies have expiration dates, and by the early 1960s, this one had expired. The space stories had grown stale. The sales had sagged year after year. And inside the publisher's offices, a quiet, unthinkable conversation had begun. The books were reportedly close to cancellation. The most famous dark hero on Earth, the 10-cent miracle of 1939, came within a whisper of simply ending. His title shut down. His manor sold off in some final issue nobody would have kept. The rescue came from an editor, which feels right. Since an editor's discomfort had created the no-kill code and an industry's panic had created the code itself. Editors are the invisible weathermakers of this whole story. This one was named Julius Schwartz, a former literary agent for science fiction writers. Sharp and practical, and in 1964 he was handed the drowning bat and told to save it. Schwartz's rescue was announced, fittingly, as the new look. The alien pets in rainbow suits were swept away like party decorations the morning after. A yellow oval appeared around the chest symbol, a small change that somehow made everything feel intentional again. The art turned sleek and modern, and most importantly, the stories went home. Back to Gotham, back to crime, back to mysteries a reader could actually solve along the way. Because Schwartz understood the thing the 50s had misplaced. The word detective was printed right there in the title, and it had been printed there since 1937 for a reason. Sales recovered. The patients sat up in bed. And this is the first full swing of a pattern I promised you at the start of the night. So let me name it properly now, because we will watch it swing 5 more times before sunrise. Call it the pendulum. Roughly every 15 or 20 years for his entire existence, this character swings between darkness and lightness, between the creature and the scout leader, between midnight and noon. And the pendulum is never pushed from inside the stories. It is always pushed by the real world. Depression made him dark. A world war made him bright. A censorship panic made him silly. An editor's rescue made him serious. In the very next push, already gathering as the 1960s found their color, would swing him further into lightness than anyone dreamed possible. So far that for a few loud years, he would become the single biggest thing on planet Earth. We will meet that swing in the next chapter, and it wears a mask over very cheerful eyes. For now though, rest inside this one. Think of the rainbow suits, folded away in some imaginary attic of the mythology. Each one a slightly ridiculous piece of armor that got the character through a decade that wanted him gone. Everyone has a drawer like that somewhere. The versions of ourselves we wore to survive a strange season, a job, a year, a grief. It is all right to smile at them. They worked. Breathe in, slow, and out, slower. The strange decade is over. The cave is dark and quiet again, the way it likes to be. And somewhere out in California, in 1965, a television producer is reading a Batman comic on an airplane and beginning, very slowly, to grin. On the evening of January 12, 1966, at 7:30 on a Wednesday night, the American Broadcasting Company aired the first episode of a television program that would, within about 8 weeks, make our hero the most famous fictional person on the planet. Not the most famous superhero. It's the most famous fictional person. For a little while in 1966, it was not close. The show was simply called Batman. It starred a warm, marvelously deadpan actor named Adam West, and it aired not once but twice a week. Wednesdays and Thursdays, each Wednesday ending on a cliffhanger with the hero dangling over some elaborate doom and an announcer urging everyone back. Same bat time, same bat channel. Those phrases entered the language within a month and have never left it. And I want to describe what the show actually was, because if you have never seen it, no description quite prepares you. It was filmed in colors that did not exist in nature. Grape purples and taxi yellows and swimming pool blues. At the exact moment, color televisions were arriving in American living rooms, and it looked like a comic book that had learned to move. Fight scenes paused for painted sound effect words to crash across the screen. The camera tilted sideways whenever villains appeared, so that evil was always slightly diagonal. The hero delivered solemn lectures about seatbelts and homework with the gravity of a president addressing the nation. Celebrities begged to appear, and the show invented a running gag just to accommodate them. Famous faces popping out of windows as the heroes climbed past on a wall that was obviously and gloriously a floor turned on its side. The country lost its mind. Both weekly episodes charted among the highest rated programs in America. Within months, there was a full theatrical movie rushed into cinemas in the summer of 1966. And the merchandise, oh, the merchandise. Lunchboxes, board games, trading cards, model kits, capes, cowls, toy, utility belts, records, bubble bath. Historians of the toy business talk about 1966 the way meteorologists talk about a 100-year storm. The show aired in dozens of countries, and children on several continents learned the same theme song, which consisted almost entirely of one word. They called it Batmania, in an echo of the Beatlemania still ringing through the decade. And for the men who had built the character, it was a strange kind of weather. Bob Kane became a celebrity all over again, delighted, giving interviews as the credited creator of the sensation. Bill Finger, who had shaped the man, the city, the cape, and the vow, watched the biggest bat storm in history from the outside, still writing television and comics work for hire. Still, to the wide world, nobody in particular. He did, at least, get something. He co-wrote one 2-part episode of the show itself in its second season. It was one of the very few times in his life his name appeared on screen attached to the character he had invented. Hold that. gently. It matters later. Now, was the show a betrayal of the Dark Knight? Whole generations of fans have argued about it, sometimes bitterly, and I want to offer you the sleepier, kinder answer, because I think it is also the truer one. The show was not a betrayal. It was a mirror. 1966 America was pop art and go-go boots and plastic optimism, culture and love with its own bright surfaces. And the pendulum did what the pendulum always does. It swung the character to wherever the country was standing. The camp was not laughing at the hero, exactly. It was the whole decade laughing at itself, with the hero as its straight man. And Adam West understood the assignment perfectly, playing every absurd line with total sincerity, which is the only way camp ever works. There is real craft in that, and real warmth, as to millions of children who did not find it funny at all, who watched with enormous eyes and simply believed. In every long life, little dreamer gets to be a little ridiculous for a while. Yours will too, if you are lucky. The photographs will exist, and the people who love you will laugh at them, and the laughter will be a form of love. The 60s show is the mythology's embarrassing beloved photo album, and the mythology is big enough to hold it, and I cannot leave 1966 without lingering on its people, because the show was carried by performers who understood the strange, delicate thing they were making. Cesar Romero, an old Hollywood leading man, played the grinning clown in white grease paint, slathered, famously, directly over his mustache, because he simply refused to shave it, and the show, in perfect keeping with its spirit, did not care. Burgess Meredith quacked and squawked his way through the umbrella villain so memorably that the comics redrew the character to match him. Frank Gorshin's riddling trickster earned an Emmy nomination, an almost unheard of honor for the genre, and the cat burglar was played across the run by two different remarkable women, Julie Newmar and then Eartha Kitt, whose pairing, entirely self-possessed take on the character remains, for many, definitive, and whose casting, a black actress in a glamorous leading villain role on primetime television in 1967, mattered in ways the show barely paused to notice, and history has noticed ever since. The rushed 1966 theatrical film gave the world one more immortal gift, a scene in which the hero, dangling from a helicopter above the ocean, fends off a rubber shark by producing, from his utility belt, a can of shark-repellent bat spray. Tired generations have laughed at that can. But notice what the laughter is made of. It is made of affection, and of the belt itself. Bill Finger's old idea, the promise that the prepared man always has exactly one gadget left. Even at its silliest, the mythology was running on the original 1939 engine.
And Adam West deserves his own gentle paragraph, because his story after the show is one of the sweetest arcs in this whole history. When Batmania collapsed, it collapsed on him personally. He was so completely identified with the role that serious work dried up for years, and he spent a long stretch in the wilderness of car show appearances and small parts, a man typecast by his own triumph. It would have been easy to grow bitter, and by every account he simply refused. He made peace with the cow, then made friends with it, spent his later decades delighting new generations, found a joyful second act voicing a daft version of himself on animated television, and by the time he died in 2017, at 88, he was universally beloved, mourned by the very fandom that had once been embarrassed by him. The city of Los Angeles lit a bat signal against the tower of City Hall the night after his death, and thousands stood in the street beneath it. Sometimes the pendulum swings all the way back around to love. It just needs 50 years and a little patience. The storm, like all storms, passed quickly. Ratings that had touched the sky in 1966 sagged in 1967. And by March of 1968, after 120 episodes, the show was gone, cancelled, its props auctioned, its bat poles dismantled. Overexposure had done what Dr. Wortham never could, and had left the comic books in a genuinely strange position. Because the whole world now believed the character was a joke in the fondest possible way, and the sales, after a huge spike, crashed hard. Which set the stage, as endings always do in this story, for a beginning. Because in the quiet after the storm, a young writer and a young artist were about to walk into the offices of DC Comics with the same thought at the same time. A thought that had been waiting patiently since 19th. What if we made him frightening again? That swing of the pendulum, the great darkening, is where our story goes after a short rest. And it deserves the rest, because everything after it is the modern age. So let this chapter end the way the show's episodes ended, but softer, with no cliffhanger, no peril. Just the announcer's voice slowed down to a bedtime murmur. Same bad time, same batch gnaw, same warm bed, same steady breath, same fire settling in the grate. The 60s are folding themselves away now, lunchbox by lunchbox, into the attic of the century. Sleep, if you like. The creature of the night is about to come home, and he moves quietly. Before we go back to Gotham, come stand outside with me for a few minutes. In the true night, the one with no publishers or pendulums in it, because we have spent all this time on a man dressed as a bat, and we have not once talked about the bats. They are the only mammals on Earth that truly fly. Not glide, the way squills cheat at it, but fly, with powered, swimming wing beats, on wings that are really hands, long, delicate finger bones, webbed with skin. Which is why science named their whole order Chiroptera, from old Greek words meaning hand-wing. When a bat flies, it is doing something closer to breaststroke than to anything a bird does. It is swimming through the dark. And the dark is no obstacle at all, because most bats hear the world instead of seeing it. They sing out little clicks, too high for our ears, and listen for the echo. And from those returning whispers of sound they build a picture of the night. Every moth, every branch, every telephone wire, rendered in echo. Scientists call it echolocation. But I like to say it the bedtime way. A bat hears the shape of the dark. It calls out, and the world answers. And the answer is a map. There is something in that worth keeping under your pillow. The dark is not empty, and it is not silent. It answers, if you know how to listen. Sailors knew it, mapping sea floors with sound. Mothers know it, hearing a house's every nighttime creak, and knowing which ones are nothing. You know it too, in the way a familiar room stays navigable with the lights off. Your own quiet echolocation built from 10,000 safe nights. Bats rest upside down, and even that has a gentle logic. Their legs are built for hanging, not standing. So, for a bat, hanging is effortless, the deepest rest available. They fold their hand wings around themselves like a person pulling up a blanket. And they let go of everything except one simple grip. And the grip itself requires no effort, because their tendons locked closed by design. A sleeping bat is not holding on. It is being held by its own architecture. Be like that now, if you can. Stop holding on. Let the bed do the gripping. You were built with an architecture for rest too, and it engages the moment you stop supervising it. For most of history, humans wrote bats into their fears, creatures of omens and belfries and Gothic novels. But plenty of cultures knew better. In China, the bat has long been a symbol of good luck and happiness, partly because the words sound alike. and 5 bats together stand for the 5 blessings. Among them health, long life, and a peaceful natural end, which is more or less what a good night's sleep rehearses. The animal that a frightened Western century turned into a monster was on the other side of the world, painted on gifts to wish people joy. Same creature, same dark, different story, which is, when you think about it, the entire lesson of the character we are spending tonight with, and possibly the entire lesson of night itself. The bats are out there right now, somewhere above the rooftops, swimming through the black on their hand wings, hearing the shape of everything, harming no one, eating the mosquitoes as a favor to us all. The night is being managed. It always was. Back to the story soon. But no hurry. Hang here a while. Now, come back to Gotham with me, because it is 1970. And something wonderful is happening in a quiet office in New York. The party decorations of the 60s are being taken down, and 2 young men are standing in the wreckage of Batmania with the same thought at the same time. The writer was named Dennis O'Neil, a former newspaper reporter from Missouri with a journalist's eye for how cities actually break. And the artist was Neil Adams, a draftsman so gifted that his figures seemed to have bones and weather and weight. Neither of them had invented the character. Both of them had grown up with him, and both of them believed, with the quiet certainty of people who have loved something since childhood, that the world had gotten him wrong. Their idea was almost embarrassingly simple. Go back. Back past the lunchboxes, past the rainbow suits, past the war bonds and the scout leader's smile. All the way back to those first 6 pages in 1939, to the creature Bill Finger had dressed in Midnight, beginning around 1970. In stories with titles full of graves and ghosts and secrets, they rebuilt him from the shadows up. Under Adams's pencil, the cape grew. That is the detail everyone remembers first, and it deserves its fame. The sensible little cape of the television years stretched and billowed until it moved like smoke, like wings, like a piece of the night that had decided to follow one man around. The ears on the cowl lengthened, the jaw hardened. The figure stopped standing in rooms like a person and started arriving in them like weather. And under O'Neill's typewriter, the word creature came home to the stories. The fear came home. The detective came home. Criminals in these new pages did not trade quips with the hero. They looked up, saw something impossible against the moon, and felt their courage leave the building. And in June of 1971, in issue 232 of the hero's own title, O'Neil and Adams gave him something he had never truly had, an equal. Not another crook with a gimmick, but a mastermind. An elegant, ancient, unhurried man whose name, translated from Arabic, means the demon's head, who had extended his life across centuries using hidden pits of restoring chemistry, and who looked at the polluted, corrupted modern world and concluded with perfect calm that most of humanity needed to be washed away so the planet could heal. He was an environmentalist, as imagined by a nightmare, a villain whose motives were almost noble and whose methods were unforgivable. And he came with 2 companions who complicated everything, a daughter, Talia, who loved the hero sincerely, and a private knowledge no enemy had ever possessed. He knew he had deduced the name under the cowl effortlessly as a compliment, for the first time in 3 decades. Our hero faced someone who could not be fooled by the idle Richmond act, someone who addressed him always by a title of grudging respect, calling him the detective. Think about what that did to the mythology. Every previous, villain had been a mirror of one flaw. This one was a mirror of the whole man. The discipline, the wealth, the world-spanning resources, the absolute conviction of being right. And the stories he generated read less like crime fiction than like chess played across continents, with sword duels in the desert and a romance that could never work tangled through the middle. The character had been a detective, then a soldier, then a joke. O'Neill and Adams made him a legend in the old sense, the sense that involves deserts and demons and destiny. The rebuild reached its most important room in 1973, in issue 251, when O'Neill and Adams took on the grinning man himself, who had spent the television years shrunken into a harmless prankster, and restored him in a single celebrated story to what the first issue of 1940 had intended: a killer, unpredictable and genuinely frightening, grinning down from one of the most famous covers ever drawn. Every terrifying version since the ATA graphic novel, Nicholson, Ledger, Phoenix, all of them walk out of that one 1973 restoration. The clown had been asleep for 2 decades. O'Neill and Adams woke him up, and the mythology got its argument back: order and chaos. The vow and the punchline resumed at full volume after a long intermission. Sales did not explode the way Batmania had exploded. This was a quieter victory, a critical one, a generational one, but the readers who mattered most, the ones who would grow up to write and draw and direct everything that came after, were children and teenagers exactly then, and they never forgot what those pages felt like. Nearly every version of the character you have ever seen on a screen descends directly from the 1970s rebuild. When people say the definitive take, this is usually, whether they know it or not, the one they mean. And there is a bedtime idea buried in how the rescue was done, one of my favorites of the whole night, so let me lift it out carefully. O'Neill and Adams did not save the character by adding things. They saved him by taking things away. The alien pets, the imps, the gimmicks, the oval of daylight around everything. All of it was carried out of the house like clutter, until what remained was the original 1939 furniture: a wound, a vow, a rule, a city, and the dark. Renewal by subtraction. We mostly believe rest works the other way. We think we need to add something to feel restored: a vacation, a purchase, a plan. But sleep, the deepest renewal there is pure subtraction. You lie down and you set things down, one by one. The day's noise, the schedule, the arguments, the light itself, until what remains is just the original furniture of you breathing in the dark. That is what you are doing right now. You are being edited by the night, gently, back to your essentials, and you will wake up restored, not because anything was added, but because so much was carried out. So let the night keep editing. Somewhere in the early 70s, a longer cape is moving across the moon, and its owner has never been more himself.
When you are ready, I want to stop the clock entirely for a little while and walk you through the city he guards, because we have been sprinting past it for 30 years a story. And it is, secretly, the best bedtime location in all of fiction. Every myth needs a landscape, and ours has one of the great ones. So let us leave the timeline behind for a chapter and simply go for a night walk in Gotham City. Bring a coat. It is always about to rain there, and it is always, somehow, 3 in the morning. Start with the name itself, because the true history of the word Gotham is a bedtime story on its own, and I have been saving it all night. Long before comic books, Gotham was a real village in Nottinghamshire, England, and its name, in the old language, meant something wonderfully humble. Goat Town, the place where the goats are. Entered medieval folklore, Gotham became famous as the Village of Fools, the town whose residents did everything backward. Raking the pond to catch the moon's reflection, building a fence around a bird to keep it from flying away. But the folktales have a twist, and the twist is the good part. According to the legend, the fools of Gotham were not fools at all. The story goes that the king intended to seize land in the village, so the villagers, hearing he was coming, decided to act thoroughly, dedicatedly mad, because madness was catching. People believed, and no king would want to roll through a contagious town. The king's men arrived, watched the pond raking and the bird fencing, and reported back that Gotham was hopeless. The king built his road elsewhere. The village kept its fields. In the proverb, "The tale left behind," says that more fools pass through Gotham than remain in it. Centuries later, in 1807, the American writer Washington Irving was publishing a satirical magazine that poked fun at New York City. He reached back to that old legend and nicknamed New York Gotham, the village of self-important fools. New Yorkers, in the way of New Yorkers, adopted the insult as a badge, and the nickname stuck for over a century, which is how it was sitting there in the phone book era of 19TT9 when Bill Finger went looking for a name for his imaginary city. So, the city of the world's greatest detective is named through a chain of jokes for centuries long, after a town of pretend fools who outsmarted a king by acting mad. A place whose whole founding legend is a performance, a mask, a false self worn in public to protect what mattered. Tell me, the mythology did not choose its name well. Tell me, the universe does not occasionally rhyme. Now walk with me down the streets themselves. The writers and artists have spent 80 years agreeing, without ever quite signing anything, on what Gotham feels like. It is New York, but only the bottom half of the hourglass, the midnight half. The buildings go up forever and lean in slightly, like eavesdroppers. Gargoyles crowd every ledge, far more gargoyles than any real city has ever installed, because Gotham's architecture is honest about what architecture is for. Perching. Steam rises from the grates. Gothic cathedrals stand shoulder to shoulder with Art Deco towers, so the skyline reads as every dark decade of the American city at once. And it is corrupt, of course, famously, foundationally corrupt. The police for sale, the judges for rent, which is the story-ending reason the hero has to exist. But spend enough slow time there, and you notice the stranger, softer truth underneath. Gotham is also stubbornly, movingly alive. People stay. They run diners and drive cabs and raise children and root for the home team in a city that gives them every reason to leave. And the stories have always quietly insisted that this loyalty is the point. The hero does not protect Gotham because it is good. He protects it because it is his, and because he believes, against nightly evidence, that it can be better. There may be no more hopeful premise in fiction, and it is wearing the least hopeful costume. And no walk through Gotham is complete without pausing at the gates of its most famous address. So, let us stand here a moment, in the rain, and look up at Arkham Asylum, the Gothic hospital on the hill where the Rogues Gallery spends its intermissions. It arrived in the comics in 1974, and its name is a borrowed one, lifted as a deliberate tip of the hat from the horror writer H.P. Lovecraft, who had invented a cursed fictional New England town called Arkham for his stories half a century earlier. So the asylum is a haunted house by etymology, built out of another mythology's shadows, and the stories have treated it accordingly, giving it a tragic founder, a history of good intentions gone wrong, and a revolving front door that fans have joked about for 50 years. But here is the gentler reading of that revolving door, the bedtime reading, and I think it is the true one. The asylum exists in the mythology because the hero insists on it. He does not deliver his enemies to executioners. Remember, he cannot. The rule forbids it. And so, the story requires a place where broken people are held with at least the possibility of mending. And every so often, in the best stories, someone actually does mend, walks out, stays out. The asylum keeps failing, and the city keeps rebuilding it, and the hero keeps filling it instead of the graveyard, because the entire moral wager of this myth is that no one, not even the worst knight's worst architect, is beyond the reach of the word yet. Thus, it is the strangest building in fiction, a horror house whose foundation is hope. Then look at the map of his own life, because the geography is a diagram, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Above ground, on the green edge of the city, stands the manor, the public self, inherited, polished, slightly hollow, the rooms where the smiling performance happens. Beneath it, connected by hidden stairs, the cave, the private self, carved out of bedrock and grief, where the true work is done and the trophies of survived battles hang in the dark. And all around the city, everyone else, the whole loud world of other people and their troubles, a house for the mask, a cave for the truth, stairs in between, and a city beyond. Now, tell me, honestly, whether you do not own that exact floor plan yourself. Everyone has a manor, the self we keep upstairs for company. Everyone has a cave, the underground room where the real memories and the real projects and the real griefs are kept. And every night, at bedtime, we do precisely what he does. We leave the manor, we take the hidden stairs down, sit a while among our own trophies and wounds, in the quiet under the house, because that is where restoration happens, in the dark, below the public floors, with the whole city sleeping overhead. You are on those stairs right now, little dreamer. You have been descending them this whole chapter. The manor is locked, the city is quiet, and the cave, whatever yours holds, is not a frightening place tonight, right? It is just the deepest room of the house, and the bats overhead are only thoughts, circling slower and slower, looking for their places on the ceiling. Let them land. Here is a riddle with a warm answer. What do you call a man who insists he works alone, and has insisted so, continuously, for 80 years? You call him what the stories have always secretly called him, the loneliest man in fiction, who cannot stop building a family. It is the warmest contradiction in the whole mythology, and this chapter belongs to it. Begin with the oldest ally, because he was there before the costume was a week old. Commissioner James Gordon appeared in the very first 6-page story in 1939, which makes him, by a matter of panels, the second oldest character in the entire mythology. He began as furniture, a policeman for the plot to happen near, but the decades did something lovely to him. The writers slowly realized that an honest cop in a corrupt city is not a supporting character. Their partnership became one of the quiet marvels of the medium. Key, two tired men meeting on a rooftop beside a searchlight, comparing notes on an impossible city, each one the only person the other fully trusts. And the searchlight itself, the great bat-shaped signal sweeping the clouds, deserves a sentence of appreciation, because it is really Gordon's character rendered as infrastructure. K. A policeman's public admission that the law alone is not enough, and a lighthouse built for exactly one ship. Then the butler, Fred, arrived in the 1940s as comic relief, plump and amateurish, dreaming of being a detective himself and bumbling through the cave. The performance history changed him as film and television versions cast elegant, dry, capable actors. And the comics absorbed the improvements, the way this myth always does, until the modern Alfred locked into place. Former soldier, former field medic, sometimes former intelligence man, permanently armed with a tea tray and the driest wit in Gotham. But his true role, the one that makes grown readers unexpectedly emotional, is simpler. He is the father who stayed. He was there the night the alley happened, hey, and he made a decision no employment contract covered, and he raised the boy, hey, and when the boy grew into something strange and nocturnal and magnificent and worrying, he stayed anyway. He stitches the wounds at 4 a.m, says the sharp, loving thing no one else is permitted to say. He is the mythology's proof that family is a verb that's showing up decade after decade, meal after meal, wound after wound, is its own kind of heroism, quieter than Cape Sand. The stories gently suggest harder, and then the children, because there really are children, a whole succession of them. The first boy in bright colors grew up, as boys do, and chafed at being a junior partner, as grown boys do, and eventually left to lead his own team and take his own name, Nightwing, becoming the mythology's great success story, the proof that the cave can be a school and not only a shrine. A second boy took up the colors after him, and his story is a bell we will ring, softly and sadly, in a later chapter, because it changed everything. There were more after that, each one different, each one a new argument between the man's loneliness and his heart. And in January of 1967, the family gained its most consequential member almost by television accident. The comics introduced in the third season of the Adam West Show quickly showcased a new figure, the commissioner's own daughter, Barbara, a doctorate-holding librarian who sold herself a costume for a masquerade ball, stumbled into an actual crime on the way, and discovered she was extremely good at this. The family's strangest late arrival deserves his own paragraph, because he completes the pattern in the most unexpected way. In 2006, the writer Grant Morrison reached back to an old 1980s story and made it canon that the hero and the demon's daughter, Talia, had a child, and the boy arrived in the cave, age 10, already lethal. What followed, across a decade of stories, is one of the best long arcs the comics ever ran. The weapon slowly, grudgingly, hilariously becoming a boy, learning the rule, adopting strays, befriending a cow at one point. I am not inventing that, and taking up the bright colors himself as the newest boy wonder. The Loners family, which had grown by tragedy and by choice for 70 years, finally grew the ordinary way, and the stories wrung every drop of comedy and tenderness out of the world's darkest man packing a school lunch. Even the dog came back, by the way. A new ace, a rescued and retrained hound, pads around the modern cave, and the fans greet his every appearance like a returning soldier. Step back and look at the completed portrait, because from a distance it is almost funny. The grim avenger of the night, the famous loner, is at the center of the largest, most elaborate found family in superhero fiction. A household so crowded the fans call it the Bat Family, capital letters, as official as anything unofficial can be. The stories joke about it constantly. Kay Clowers, he insists he works best alone, and behind him stand a father, 4 sons, several daughters, a brother in a trench coat, and a dog. The contradiction is the point, and it is our warmest thread of the night, so let me tie it off properly. The vow in the alley was a promise that no one else would ever be alone the way that boy was alone, and you cannot keep that promise by yourself. It is logically impossible, okay, to unlonely the world. You must let people in, okay? And so, the fortress, a grieving child, built to keep everyone out, became, room by room, decade by decade, a home. Grief built the cave. Love kept filling it with beds. That is what grief does, if you let it run its full course. Hey, it starts as a locked door and ends, years later, as a guest room. Every person in that cave arrived through the same wound. Orphans and strays and stubborn friends, drawn to a man who understood loss. And the family they made is not a betrayal of his sorrow. It is his sorrow matured. It is what the alley grew into. So if you carry a loss of your own to bed tonight, and most grown people do, hold this chapter against it like a warm compress. The loneliest man in fiction ended up with the fullest house. These things take decades, and they happen to one loyal person at a time. And they are happening to you, too, at their own speed, whether or not you have noticed. Breathe in, slowly, and out, longer. The manor is full tonight. Lights in the kitchen, the young ones arguing over patrol routes, The old soldier setting out tea. Even the searchlight on police headquarters is really just a porch light left on by a friend. Sleep is close now. I can hear it in the fire. But the story is about to grow up all at once in a single famous year, and I want to tell you about it while your eyes are still half open. The year is 1986, and an old man is coming out of retirement. By the middle of the 1980s, comic books in America had a strange problem, which was that their readers had refused to go away. The children of the 60s and 70s had grown up, but a great many of them had kept reading. And the medium suddenly had an audience of adults with adult questions, buying their comics in a brand new kind of store, the dedicated comic shop, which meant publishers could finally print stories the corner newsstand would never have carried. All that was missing was a creator willing to ask the biggest adult question of all. He turned out to be a young writer and artist named Frank Miller, who had already made his name turning a blind hero's title into hard-boiled crime fiction. And the question he asked was this: what happens to the vow when the man who made it grows old? The answer arrived in February of 1986, in the first of 4 oversized prestige format issues, printed on paper comics had never used, at a price comics had never charged, under a title that would become one of the most famous in the medium's history, and that imagined the night the vow woke back up, the storm through which an old man came off the shelf like a sword, too old for this, magnificently unwilling to care. The format itself was part of the revolution, and it changed how the whole culture would encounter these stories forever after. The 4 issues were gathered between square-bound covers and sold as a single book in bookstores, actual bookstores, under a term the industry was just then teaching the public to say: graphic novel. Libraries began stocking them. Newspapers reviewed them alongside prose. A medium that had lived and died on newsstand months suddenly had a permanent shelf, a backlist, a canon, and the collected editions of that decade's landmarks have never once been out of print since, which means a 14-year-old can walk into a library tonight for decades on and check out 1986 like it happened last week. The stories stopped being periodicals and became literature's noisy younger siblings, seated, at last, at the table. I will keep the plot at that soft distance because the story belongs to its makers, but the impact belongs to history, and the impact was seismic. The series was reviewed, seriously, and at length, in mainstream newspapers and magazines that had never once reviewed a comic book. It sold out printing after printing, alongside another landmark series published that same astonishing year. A deconstruction of superheroes by a British writer. It forced an entire culture to update its file on what comics were. The phrase everyone reached for, in headline after headline, was that comics had grown up, and 1986 was the year the phrase stuck. Then, barely a year later, Miller did something almost more influential and much quieter. Having shown the character's ending, he went back and rebuilt the beginning across 4 issues of the main title in 1987. In a story called Simply Year One, he and the artist David Mazzucchelli told the first 12 months at street level, and a bat crashing through the window. Year One also performed a small act of justice that I want you to notice, because our quiet man is in this chapter, after all. It rebuilt Commissioner Gordon in full, giving him half the story of an honest cop's slow war against his own corrupt department. The pendulum, you will notice, had swung all the way to midnight, further than even the 70s had taken it. And midnight has a gravity. Once the culture rediscovered that this character could carry real darkness, real age, real grief, the stories raced toward the darkest door in the house, the one the writers had been circling for almost 50 years. Behind it was the grinning man, and a question no one had ever quite dared to put in print. How did he get that way, and how far will he go? 1988 answered both, and it is the heaviest year in this whole history, so I will carry it carefully and briefly, the way you carry something fragile through a dark room. Early that year came a slim graphic novel painted in sickly carnival colors that proposed a possible origin for the clown. One bad day that broke an ordinary, failing man into pieces and set that proposal against the present, in which he sets out to prove that one bad day is all it would take to break anyone, choosing the commissioner's family and Barbara as his proof. The book is brilliant and troubling and has been argued about for nearly 40 years, including by its own celebrated author, who later voiced doubts about it. Its consequences for Barbara were real and lasting, and the best thing the following decades did was refuse to let her be a casualty, rebuilding her instead into the all-seeing oracle of the hero community. The wound turned, once again, to face forward. And then, in the autumn of 1988, came the telephone. He was written angrier, rougher, and the letters pages grumbled about him. Us. The publisher did something that had never been done in the history of fiction, and has never quite been done again. At the end of an issue in which the boy lay gravely hurt, the story stopped, and 2 telephone numbers were printed on the page. 1 number 2 vote that he lives. 1 number 2 vote that he dies. 50 cents a call, 36 hours of voting. The fate of a 14-year-old character placed, live, in the hands of the audience. More than 10,000 calls came in. And when the lines closed, the vote to let him die had won by exactly 72 calls. 5,343 to 5,271. 72 phone calls out of a nation. The next issue carried the result, and the mainstream news carried the uproar. And the uproar was enormous. Editorials and television segments asking what kind of medium kills a child by referendum. I find I cannot be entirely cynical about it all these years later, and here is why. However crass the stunt, the grief it produced was completely real, on the page and off it. The stories treated the loss as sacred for decades afterward. A memorial case went up in the cave, the empty costume behind glass, with a small plaque calling him a good soldier. And it stood there, issue after issue, year after year. The mythology's one permanent wound, the failure the hero carried into every subsequent night. Grief had been the character's origin. Now it was his ongoing condition, which is, if we are honest, the truer picture of how grief works. The decade after the telephone kept faith with the wound in ways worth a slow paragraph. A new boy eventually earned the colors, and I do mean earned, because the writers, chastened, built him deliberately as the anti-tragedy, a bright, deductive, well-adjusted kid with living parents who figured out the hero's identity on his own and argued his way into the cave on a thesis that the Dark Knight, left alone with his grief, gets worse and needs a partner, not as a soldier, but as a tether. The mythology, in other words, wrote its own grief counseling into canon, and it said so, almost out loud, in story after story, that the family exists because the alternative, the man alone in the dark with the glass case, is the one future everyone in the cave has quietly agreed to prevent. There's a bedtime truth here, and it is a tender one, so let me set it down softly and not press on it. Even in stories, even in the safest made-up worlds we build, loss finds a way in, because we bring it with us. We cannot write worlds without it, because we have never lived in one. And the comfort, such as it is the same in fiction as in life. The story keeps going. The family gathers closer. The case in the cave gets dusted and honored and lived alongside. 1988 taught the mythology how to mourn, and the mythology has been wiser and kinder ever since. Let that year go now, the way you set down something heavy at the end of a long carry. Unclenched your hands. Let the mattress take the weight, because the very next summer, the real world threw the pendulum a party the size of the planet, and it is one of the most purely fun chapters of the night. Abayim, the year is 1989, the month is June, and every t-shirt on Earth is about to turn black and gold. It began, as modern legends often do, with an announcement that made everyone furious. Warner Brothers had spent most of a decade trying to mount a serious film about the Dark Knight. And by the late 80s, they had their director, a pale young visionary named Tim Burton, who dressed like a Victorian undertaker and saw the world in beautiful, crooked shadows. What they did not have, the fans howled, was a hero. Because for the lead role, Burton chose Michael Keaton, an actor known almost entirely for comedies. The reaction has become industry folklore. Reportedly, some 50,000 letters of protest poured into the studio. An avalanche of outrage in an era when complaining required a stamp. Fans who had spent 2 decades living down the 1960s television show heard the word comedian and assumed the worst, that the joke was coming back. Warner Brothers stock reportedly wobbled. It is, in hindsight, one of the great wrong predictions in the history of audiences, and there is a lesson in it about trusting quiet, watchful actors, because Keaton understood something the letter writers did not. The man is the mask. Anyone can play the creature. The hard part is playing the strange, still, slightly haunted person underneath, and comedians know more about masks than anyone alive. The film arrived on June 23, 1989, wrapped in a marketing campaign the likes of which the world had never seen. The teaser poster was nothing but the gold and black symbol. No title, no faces, because none were needed. That summer, the symbol was everywhere, on hats, on shirts, on shaved heads, an entire planet wearing one logo. The film smashed the opening weekend records of its day and went on to earn more than $400 million worldwide at 1989 ticket prices against a budget around $35 million. Jack Nicholson, who played the grinning man under a contract that famously traded salary for a percentage of the take, including the merchandise, reportedly earned somewhere between $50 and $90 million, which stood for years as one of the richest single paydays an actor had ever received for one role. And the film itself held up its end. Burton's Gotham, built enormous and crooked on sound stages in England by the designer Anton Furst, who won an Academy Award for it, was the first time the city of the comics truly existed at scale. A gothic industrial fever dream with no sky. The music, a thunderous main theme by Danny Elfman, became as recognizable as the symbol. It was dark, genuinely dark, a summer blockbuster that ended in a cathedral at midnight, and the audiences that were supposed to be scared away came back 4 and 5 times. Bob Kane visited the set, photographed, celebrated, credited on screen as always, and alone as always. Bill Finger had been gone for 15 years by that summer. Every review that praised the film's mythology, the vow, the city, the cape-like wings against the moon, was praising, without knowing it, a shoe salesman's weekend in 1939 told that we are getting closer to fixing it. Burton returned in the summer of 1992 with a second film, and the second film is worth a slow paragraph, 'cause it is one of the strangest big-budget movies a studio ever released to a mass family audience. Batman Returns was a hit, over $260 million worldwide, but it was also a gothic winter fairy tale about broken people, a grotesque, abandoned child villain in the sewers, and Michelle Pfeiffer's shattering, stitched-together cat burglar, a meek secretary pushed out a window by her employer who comes back wrong and right and unforgettable in a vinyl suit sewn shut with her own furious seams. Her performance is still, 30 years on, the one every subsequent version is measured against. But the film unnerved parents, and it famously unnerved a fast food partner whose kids' meal promotion sat awkwardly beside all that beautiful damage, and the studio's nerves about it are precisely what handed the franchise to brighter hands, with the results we will grieve together shortly. Hold Returns in your memory as the road not taken, the proof, decades early, that this mythology could be art house strange and still fill theaters. The 1889 film did one more enormous thing, and it did it 3 years later, almost as a side effect. Its success convinced Warner Brothers to commission an animated series for weekday afternoons. and the small team assembled for it, led by the artists Bruce Timm and Eric Radomski, and the writer-producers alongside them, made a decision that should not have been possible on a children's cartoon budget. Okay, they painted their backgrounds on black paper. Light was added to darkness instead of the other way around, so the whole city glowed like night footage of the 1940s, a style the team called Dark Deco. The show premiered on September 5th, 1992, and it is spoken of today by historians and fans alike, and without much argument, as one of the finest things ever made from this mythology in any medium, films included. It treated its after-school audience as intelligent, gave its villains sad human engines, an origin of frozen grief for the Cold One that won an Emmy Award and permanently rewrote the character in every medium after. It cast voices, Kevin Conroy as the Knight and Mark Hamill as the Clown, that entire generations now hear when they read the comics silently. Conroy, a classically trained theater actor, found the performance's secret in a single choice. The hero's voice was the real one, and the playboy's voice was the act. And the series gave the mythology its last great founding gift, which is a sentence I love being able to say about a weekday cartoon. In an episode aired that first September, the writers needed a henchwoman for the Clown, a one-off, a nobody, and they invented a cheerful harlequin in a jester suit with a Brooklyn accent. The audience fell instantly, permanently in love. Harley Quinn jumped from television into the comics, then into films, then into her own films, becoming, by the 2020s, one of the most popular characters the company owns, and the stories eventually did right by her, too, walking her out of a poisonous romance and into her own light, which has made her, for millions of readers, something better than comic relief. It made her hope with a mallet. The animated team even got their own feature film, rushed to theaters at Christmas of 1993. A melancholy mystery called Mask of the Phantasm about the road not taken. An old love, and whether the vow left any room for an ordinary, happy life. It was barely marketed, and it quietly failed at the box office, and then it did what the truest things in this history always do. It waited. Home video found it. Then a generation grew up quoting it. Then the critics circled back, and today it sits on list after list as one of the finest films, animated or otherwise, ever made from this mythology. It's another seed with a long winter. They are everywhere in this story, once you start looking, and Kevin Conroy's own later chapter deserves telling here. Softly, he voiced the character for 3 full decades, longer than any actor in any medium. Thousands of performances. And near the end of his life, he wrote a short autobiographical comic about how he had found the voice in the first place. As a gay man of his generation who had spent years presenting oneself to the world while keeping the truer one below. A man who understood, in his bones, the manor and the cave, said the role had felt, from the first audition, like being handed a language he already spoke. He died in November of 2022, and the outpouring from 3 generations of fans said the same sentence 10,000 ways. That voice was my hero's voice. It still is. Recordings are a kind of amber. An entire generation, and I suspect some of you listening are that generation, was tucked in after school by that cathedral of a cartoon. Homework at the kitchen table, the light going blue outside, and Gotham glowing on black paper across the room. The mythology has never been in better hands than it was at 4 in the afternoon in 1993. So in this chapter there, in that kitchen light, with the theme music playing somewhere in memory. The Summer of the Bat made the character immortal at the box office. The animated series made him immortal somewhere more important in the deep, warm sediment of childhood. Where you are headed right now, breath by breath. The 90s, though, had one more arc to run. And it is the full pendulum in miniature, a breaking, a fall, and one of the strangest collapses in Hollywood history. Ice puns are coming, little dreamer. So is the getting back up. The early 1990s were a gold rush time in comics, stranger in some ways than the first gold rush of 1938. Collectors had noticed what old issues were worth. Speculators had noticed the collectors, and suddenly, comics were being bought by the case. Bagged, boarded, and stored unread like certificates. On the theory that every first appearance and every shocking event would someday pay for a college education, publishers, being publishers, obliged with shocking events. A famous hero of the daylight died in 1992, and the news made front pages worldwide. And Gotham's keepers, watching all this, planned their own earthquake. Theirs arrived across 1993, in a year-long story built around a brand new enemy who had been designed, quite openly, to do the impossible. His name was Bane, and everything about him was engineered as an answer key to the hero, raised from childhood inside a brutal island prison, serving out his father's sentence. He had built himself into two things at once: a monster of strength, amplified by an experimental chemical fed through tubes into his skull, and, far more dangerously, a strategist, self-educated in the prison library, patient as winter. And his plan was the thing no villain in 54 years had thought of. He did not challenge the hero. He exhausted him. He broke open the asylum and the prison and released every enemy at once, then simply waited weeks while one man tried to gather them all back, night after night, without sleep, wearing down like a candle. Only when the candle was guttering did Bane walk, unhurried, into the cave itself, into the home, and in the story's famous image, one of the most reprinted in comics history, he lifted the exhausted knight and broke his back across one knee. The mantle passed because the city still needed a symbol. To a newer, younger ally, a troubled zealot who built himself an armored version of the suit, all blades and gauntlets, and who demonstrated, month after escalating month, exactly why the vow and the code had mattered. He was more violent, more frightening, more willing, and the city was not safer. And the readers, who the publishers half expected to cheer the shiny new armored version, recoiled instead, which may have been the point all along. The broken man, meanwhile, healed, retrained, returned, and reclaimed the cowl, and the whole grand year closed on the quietest possible thesis. The suit was never the weapon. The rule was, anyone can wear armor. It takes something rarer to wear restraint. The comics closed their decade with one more colossal experiment, and it deserves a paragraph because it is secretly one of the warmest stories in the whole canon. Beginning in 1999, a year-long epic called No Man's Land imagined Gotham struck by a catastrophic earthquake, and then, in the story's audacious turn, formally abandoned by the United States government. Bridges blown, borders sealed, the city declared no longer part of the country. What remained inside was a ruined territory carved into gang fiefdoms, a handful of cops who refused evacuation, and the question of whether a place everyone else had given up on was still worth keeping. You already know his answer. The year of stories that followed was really one long love letter to the stubborn citizens of the earlier chapters, the ones who stay, and it ended with the city rebuilt, because in this mythology it always is. Buildings fall constantly in Gotham. The point of Gotham is that somebody always mixes new mortars out in Hollywood. Meanwhile, the pendulum was swinging the other way, fast and greased with money. Burton's second film, in 1992, had been a hit, but a strange one, colder and kinkier, in the studio. Nervous about scared children and unhappy fast food partners, eased Burton aside for a director named Joel Schumacher, with instructions that were, in fairness to everyone, perfectly explicit. Brighter, friendlier, more toys. 1995's film delivered neon-drenched and crowd-pleasing, and made a fortune. And so the studio ordered the same again, only more so, faster, and 2 years later, in June of 1997, the world received a film that fans speak of the way sailors speak of famous shipwrecks. It had ice puns, dozens of them. It had a bad credit card, which audiences greeted with a sound rarely heard in cinemas, the gasp of 1,000 people losing faith at once. It had costumes designed like toys and toys designed like costumes, a cast of stars visibly unsure why they were there, in a script frozen solid by committee. It was, by wide agreement, a disaster, critically mauled, financially disappointing, and franchise ending. A planned next film was canceled outright, and the character who had owned the summer of 1989 went into cinematic exile. It's pronounced dead as a film property for 8 full years. I want to be gentle with this chapter's rubble, though, for 2 reasons. The first is Joel Schumacher himself, who did something in the following years that powerful people almost never do. He apologized, plainly, repeatedly, on the record, telling fans he had let them down, taking responsibility that was at least half owed to the studio's toy-driven mandates. He kept making films, some of them very good, and when he died in 2020, the same fan culture that had spent 2 decades sharpening jokes at his expense filled the internet with unexpected tenderness. An apology, honestly given, compounds like interest. Remember that one in the daylight? And the second reason is the shape of the whole decade, seen from above, because you have surely noticed it already. A breaking in the comics, followed by healing and return. A collapse in the films, followed by exile, and, as we are about to see, the greatest return of all. The 90s are the entire pendulum in miniature, the myth teaching its one inexhaustible lesson at every scale at once. The fall is a chapter. It is never the book. What matters? The only thing that ever matters in this story is the getting back up, slowly, properly, at your own pace, with your people around you. If some year of your own life is sitting in your chest right now, some personal 1997, let this chapter sit beside it like a friend on a step. Franchises die and come back, backs break and heal. Directors apologize and are forgiven. The ledger of a long life has entries that looked, at the time, like endings, and were only winters. Breathe out the decade. We have earned a rest stop, you and I, before the modern age begins, and I know a good one. It is on a rooftop, and it is raining, and it is exactly 3 in the morning. Come stand here a moment, out of the timeline entirely. This is the interlude, the quiet landing on the staircase. Okay. And I want to talk about 3 in the morning itself. Because we have spent all night in a city where it is always that hour, and the hour deserves its due. 3 in the morning has a reputation. The old books called it the witching hour, and modern insomniacs know it as the hour of the racing mind. The time you wake, for no reason, into a house so quiet you can hear the refrigerator thinking. Here is what is actually happening, and it is friendlier than folklore. Your body runs on an internal clock, the circadian rhythm, and in the small hours, that clock deliberately turns everything down. Core temperature, blood pressure, alertness, all dimmed on purpose, the whole machine idling as designed. You surface into wakefulness, then you surface into the dimmest room of your own biology, where every thought echoes strangely. The dread of 3 in the morning is not truth arriving, it is acoustics. The same worry at 3 in the afternoon is a manageable errand, and the city outside that hour is not empty, which is the part I love. It only looks abandoned. In truth, 3 in the morning is a shift change, staffed by a whole hidden workforce of keepers. Bakers already floured, starting the bread that will be warmed by 7. Nurses walking dim corridors, checking on rooms full of sleep. Air traffic controllers guiding red ears across the dark map. Power plant operators, harbor pilots, printing press crews, running tomorrow's newspaper, a night editor somewhere, choosing the front page. The whole world you awake to at 7 is being quietly assembled, right now, by people who chose the night shift. Some for the pay, some because they simply like it out there, the streets rinsed and private, the traffic lights performing for no one. Every city has always had its night watch. Centuries before police forces, towns paid watchmen to walk the walls with lanterns and called the hours. And the call was the whole point, a voice in the dark saying the hour. and adding that all was well. People slept better for hearing it. Not because the watchman could stop an army, but because the sound meant someone is awake, so you don't have to be. That is the oldest service civilization offers, older than roads. And it is, you will have noticed, the entire job description of the character we have spent tonight with. He is the watchman's call, made of cape and shadow. The whole mythology is a voice in the dark saying the hour and adding that all is well. So here is your rooftop exercise, the only one of the night, and it asks nothing but breathing. Stand up here with me in the soft rain, collar up, city below. Breathe in slowly through your nose for a count of 4, and as you do, look out over the lights. Hold it gently, 4-4, no straining, just a pause at the top like a held note. Now, out through the mouth, slow, for a count of 8, and as you breathe out, hand the city over. The bakers have it, the nurses have it, the watchman has it. Every light down there is somebody keeping something, and none of it, not one single light, is yours to keep tonight. Again, in 4, the rain soft on the gargoyle beside you, who has held this exact post for 90 years without complaint. Hold, 4, out, 8, longer than feels natural, because the long exhale is a hand signal to your nervous system. The ancient all clear, and your heart rate follows it down like a kite being wound in. Once more, the slowest yet, in. Hold out and let it take everything. The day, the year, the small hours, echoing dread, out over the rooftops where the rain will carry it to the river. There, somewhere below us, a bakery light has come on. The shift has changed. You are officially off duty, little dreamer, by order of the night watch, and the story will finish itself from here in its softest voice. The modern age is waiting. One last climb and one long old piece of justice, and you may hear it or dream it, whichever comes first. Both count. One more small landing on the staircase before the final climb, because we have spent a whole night in the company of masks, and I have saved the gentlest true things about them for the sleepest hour. Human beings have been putting on masks for at least 9,000 years. The oldest ones we have ever found are stone faces from the hills near Jerusalem, carved before writing, before the wheel, before almost everything, and archaeologists believe they were worn in ceremonies for remembering the dead. Which means the very first thing we ever used a mask for, as far as the record shows, was grief. A face put on so that loss could be looked at. The boy in the alley is 9,000 years old. The ancient Greek theater built its whole art on masks. And their word for the mask was persona, from a root meaning to sound through. Because the actor's voice sounded through the carved mouth, we kept the word. Your persona, your personality, the person you are, all of it descends from a word for a theater mask, which the old languages understood and we have half forgotten. Every self we show is partly a performance, sounded through, and that is not a lie. It is simply how being a person works. The manor self and the cave self are both really you. The stairs between them are you too. And here's the finding that always makes people smile. Modern researchers studying children found that small children performing difficult, boring tasks persevere significantly longer when they are dressed as, and addressed as, a favorite caped hero. Scientists called it, in an actual peer-reviewed journal, the Batman effect. Ask a struggling child how they are doing, and they wilt. Ask how the hero is doing, and the hero, it turns out, is doing fine. The hero can keep going. A little distance from the self, borrowed through a mask, turns out to be strength, not escape, which is all a bedtime story is, incidentally. A mask you put on your own thoughts, a borrowed face for the day's worries, so they can be looked at from a rooftop's safe distance until they get sleepy and sit down. Yours are sitting down now. I can hear it in your breathing. So masks, verdict of 9,000 years, not for hiding, for carrying, grief, courage, the parts of us the daylight has no slot for, Put one down here on the landing, whichever one you wore today. You will not need it where we are going, which is, at last, the modern age. 8 years is a long exile. And by the early 2000s, the film character was a cautionary tale, a 90s casualty gathering dust beside the ice puns. The comics, meanwhile, had quietly kept aflame. In 2002 and 2003, a blockbuster 12-part mystery called Hush paired the company's most popular writer with its most popular artist and sent the detective through his entire gallery and his entire family, chasing a hidden enemy wrapped in bandages, a puzzle built from his own past. It sold enormously, and it reminded the industry of something Hollywood had forgotten. This character works best as a mystery. The clue was lying right there. The man who picked it up was a young British director named Christopher Nolan, fresh off clever, chilly thrillers about memory and obsession, and his pitch to Warner Brothers was almost defiantly unfashionable. No camp, no neon, no winks. Treat the story as if it could really happen. Ground every gadget in plausible engineering, every fear in psychology, and build it, as much as possible, for real, in camera, with miniatures and stunt teams instead of pixels. The studio, having nothing left to lose, said yes. The casting told the whole philosophy. Christian Bale, an intense Welsh actor famous for disappearing bodily into roles, took the cowl, but around him Nolan assembled the kind of ensemble usually reserved for prestige dramas. Michael Caine bringing 60 years of craft and warmth to the butler. Gary Oldman, nearly unrecognizable in glasses and mustache as a young, decent Gordon. Morgan Freeman as the inventor, quietly arming the mission from a corporate basement. Liam Neeson as the mentor whose teachings curdle. The message of that cast list, before a frame was shot, was that this material would be treated as material, not as merchandise. Even the cape got the realism treatment, a fabric developed with an electrostatic charge so it could stiffen into a glider's wing, and the growling armored car, reborn as a military bridge layer prototype called the Tumbler, was built as a real vehicle that really did 60 miles per hour, because Nolan wanted the camera and the audience to feel weight. Batman Begins opened on June 15, 2005, with Christian Bale under the cowl. And it did something no film had bothered to do in 66 years of the character existing. It took the origin seriously, at full length. The alley, yes, but also everything after. The guilt, the running away. The years of training in far mountains with a secretive league of warriors. The slow assembly of the mask, the fear of bats, turned deliberately inside out and worn as a weapon. It was, in structure and soul, year one brought to the screen, honest cop and all, and it rebuilt the franchise's credibility the way its hero rebuilds himself, methodically, from the foundation. Then came the second film, and the second film became a legend. The Dark Knight opened on July 18, 2008, and it remains one of the defining American films of its century's first decade. A crime epic in a cape, shot partly with enormous IMAX cameras, anchored by a real 18-wheeler flipped end over end down a Chicago street because Nolan preferred doing things to faking them. It crossed $1 billion worldwide, the first comic book film ever to do so, and it did it on the strength of a performance. Heath Ledger, an Australian actor of enormous gifts, played the grinning man, and played him as no one ever had. Not as a cackling schemer, but as an agent of pure chaos, a man with no origin at all, telling contradictory stories about his own scars because the truth was, there was no truth, only the argument, the same 8-year-old argument, that one bad day breaks anyone and nothing means anything. The performance frightened people and awed them in equal measure. And it became forever bittersweet because Ledger died in January of 2008, months before the film opened, at 28 years old, of an accidental overdose. The following February, in 2009, the Academy awarded him the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, only the second acting Oscar ever given posthumously. and his family accepted it on a night the whole industry stood to applaud an empty place. He was, by every account of those who worked beside him, joyful on that set, proud of the work. The work deserves the pride. It is studied now, the way great stage performances are studied, and it will be for a very long time. Nolan closed his trilogy in July of 2012 with a vast final chapter that borrowed his spine from the 1993 Breaking, Pain and Awe, and ended, as this mythology at its best always ends, on the idea that the symbol matters more than the man, that anyone can be the watchman, that the point of the mask was always that it could outlive its wearer. The three films together earned over $2 billion. Collected critical honors no superhero films had touched, and forced the door of serious cinema permanently open for the genre. Every caped film since lives in the house those three built, and the modern age kept unfolding, so let me give you the rest of it, the way you would flip sleepily through the last pages of a photo album. In August of 2009, a video game called Arkham Asylum arrived and astonished everyone, letting players truly inhabit the cowl for the first time, gliding, detecting, striking from shadows. With the animated series voices, Conroy and Hamill reunited behind it. It grew into a trilogy that critics called the best superhero games ever made, and for millions of younger fans, the games are their Gotham. In September of 2011, the comics rebooted their entire line, and the flagship news story sent the detective against a horror he had somehow never imagined, a secret society of wealthy old families, the Court of Owls, that claimed to have run Gotham from the shadows for centuries, hidden inside the walls of buildings his own family built. The story's unsettling engine was simple and perfect. It asked whether the world's greatest detective truly knew his own city, and for a while, thrillingly, the answer was no. Ben Affleck wore an older, wearier version of the armor beginning in March of 2016 in the gravel-toned shared universe years. And on March 4th, 2022, the pendulum completed yet another full swing with a film called Simply the Batman, starring Robert Pattinson, 3 rain-soaked hours of pure detective noir, the youngest and rawest screen version yet, hunting a riddling serial killer through a Gotham so drowned and corrupt it practically dripped off the screen. It earned over $770 million in a pandemic-wounded market, and it proved, for whatever doubt remained, that after more than 80 years, the world's appetite for this myth simply does not close. Television kept its own flame through those same years. From 2014 to 2019, a series called Gotham ran for 100 episodes on the audacious premise of telling the city's story before the hero existed, a young Detective Gordon in a metropolis curdling toward myth. And it matters to our night for one particular reason we will reach in the next chapter. It was among the very first screen productions to carry a certain long overdue credit. And in 2019, the mythology produced its strangest triumph yet, a film that contained no hero at all. Joker, a grimy 1970s-styled character study starring Joaquin Phoenix as a failing party clown sliding into the abyss, was made for around $55 million, ignited arguments about violence and sympathy that ran for months, won the top prize at the Venice Film Festival of all rarefied places, and became the first R-rated film in history to cross $1 billion worldwide. Phoenix won the Academy Award for Best Actor the following February, which means the grinning man has now delivered acting Oscar, which Burnett is, my Manning Scoim, one exclaimed a distinction. No other distinction, no other distinction, no exclaim. You and no other climb again, and though I again, you and go, and An 8-year-old villain from a 10-cent magazine, twice crowned at the Academy Awards. Somewhere, the ghost of Dr. Wortham is filing an objection, and somewhere nearer, the ghost of a certain quiet writer is permitting himself a small smile. More than 80 years. Say that number slowly. Since May of 1939, through a world war, a censorship panic, a camp explosion, a dark rebirth, a broken back, a dead franchise, and a dozen resurrections, the character has never once been out of print, not for a single month. Children who read issue 27 off the newsstand lived whole lives. Their great-grandchildren are reading him now. Which brings us, at last, to the door I have been walking you toward all night. Because one person in this story never got to see any of it, and it is finally time to go back for him. His name, in case the night has grown long and soft around you, was Bill Finger, and I want to tell you the rest of his life now. All of it, slowly, because this is the chapter the whole episode was built to reach. He was born Milton Finger on February 8, 1914, in Denver, Colorado, the son of an Austrian Jewish immigrant tailor, and the family moved east to the Bronx when he was a boy, where his father ran a shop until the Depression took it. The way the Depression took nearly everything on that street. He went to DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, and here the universe rhymes again. Because DeWitt Clinton, one public high school, also educated Bob Kane and Will Eisner and Stan Lee, for boys walking the same corridors a few years apart who would go on, among them, to invent a startling share of American mythology. Milton dreamed of medicine, then of serious writing, took the pen name Bill, and was selling shoes when the 1930s finished with him, a young man full of clipped ideas and folded ambitions, waiting, like Da Vinci's wings, for the right door. After the weekend in 1939, Finger kept writing. That is the first thing to know. For more than 25 years, he wrote hundreds upon hundreds of the stories, the origin in the alley, its first appearances of half the great villains, the tone, the tragedy, the detective's voice itself. Colleagues from those years described the same man the party guests of 1938 described. Meticulous, slow, a perfectionist who kept folders of clippings and ideas, who would hold a script past deadline because a clue did not sit right. The industry, which paid by the page and rewarded speed, treated his care as a flaw. He was often broke. He was sometimes evicted. He wrote some television in the 50s and 60s, a pair of film scripts, that single credited 2-part episode of The Adam West Show, and always, more ghost work on the character he had shaped, with another man's name printed above every word. Bob Kane, meanwhile, lived the credited life, the interviews, the celebrity, the licensing income, and for decades he publicly denied that Finger had created anything at all in print by name. In 1965, when an early comics historian published the truth after interviewing Finger, Kane wrote an open letter calling his old friend's account a fabrication. That letter followed Finger for the rest of his life. He died in January of 1974 in his apartment in New York, alone, of heart disease, at 59 years old. There was no funeral to speak of. The comics press barely marked it, and the newspapers not at all. A man whose imagination was, by then, earning fortunes annually for one of the largest entertainment companies on earth died without an obituary, and his ashes were eventually scattered by his son, Fred, on a beach in Oregon. Fred, the story goes, traced the shape of a bat in the sand first, and poured his father inside it, and let the tide take the rest. I told you at the start of the night that this story ends well, and I have not forgotten. Here is how the light comes back on, name by name, year by year. It begins with the historians, the stubborn ones, keeping the truth in print through the 70s and 80s until even Bob Kane softened. In his 1989 autobiography, of all places, in the very summer of the bat, Kane finally admitted in writing that Finger had never received the credit he deserved and called him an unsung hero. It was late, and it was partial, and Kane never did amend the contract before his death in 1998. But the wall had cracked. Then came a children's book author of All the Unlikely Nights, a writer named Mark Tyler Nobleman, who decided in the 2000s that Finger's story deserved to be told to young readers, and spent years doing the detective work the world's greatest detective would have admired. Tracking down documents, relatives, photographs of a man of whom almost no photographs survived. Its research, published in 2012 as a book called Bill the Boy Wonder, did something crucial. It found the family. It established that Finger had a living heir, a granddaughter, a mathematics educator in Florida named Athena Finger, and it helped light a public campaign under her claim. And Athena Finger did not let go, with advocates and lawyers beside her, quietly, over years. She pressed the company her grandfather had enriched, and in September of 2015, DC and Warner Brothers announced an agreement whose terms were private, but whose meaning was not. Batman, created by Bob Kane with Bill Finger. 5 words and a name. Athena and Fred's family were there for it. Fans in theaters around the world, the ones who knew the story, photographed the credit on opening night the way you photograph a sunrise. In 2017, the industry's Lifetime Achievement recognitions followed, and in New York City, a street corner in the Bronx, near where the weekend of 1939 happened, now carries a sign that reads, Bill Finger Way. So the world's greatest detective's greatest mystery. The one printed in plain sight on 60 years of covers. Who really made him was finally solved, and it was solved the way his best cases are solved. Not by force, but by people who refused to stop looking. A historian with a tape recorder, an author with a library card, a granddaughter with her family's quiet stubbornness, including tonight. There's your ending, little dreamer, the light at the end of the hallway I promised you hours ago. Justice can arrive late, absurdly late, 76 years late, and still arrive whole. The truth is patient in a way lies never manage, and nothing given honestly into the world. No idea, no kindness, no scalloped cape suggested softly across a friend's table is ever really lost. It waited. It always waits. Dave Vinci's wings waited 400 years. Bill Finger's name waited 76. Whatever of yours feels unseen tonight is simply still in the waiting part. Rest easy on that. The name is on the screen. The tide took the ashes, but the sand remembered the shape. We are nearly home now, so let me bank the fire and gather up the threads. The way a storyteller folds a blanket at the end of the night, corner to corner, until it fits in 2 hands. We followed the pendulum all night, dark to light, too dark again, 1939 to 2022, and you know now what it really is. It was never the character swinging. It was us. Every era got the version it needed. A pulp avenger for the frightened 30s. A smiling scout for the war. A rainbow for the atomic age. A creature for the disillusioned 70s. A billion-dollar tragedy for the anxious new century. The myth is a mirror with a cape on, and mirrors do not change. Rooms do. We followed the fear and found it was the friendliest thread of all. A boy is frightened of bats, and of the dark, and of the worst night of his life, and instead of running from any of it, he puts it on. He wears the fear so that fear ends up working for the porch lights instead of against them. That is not a superpower. That is a bedtime skill. The very one you were taught with nightlights and checked closets and stories like this one. The skill of looking at the dark until it resolves into furniture. He is simply the best there's ever been at it. A professional at the thing every child practices. We followed the vow. Grief turned to face forward and watched what it built. A rule that held for 80 years. A cave that filled with family. Promise made kneeling that ended up holding up a whole imaginary city and a fair amount of the real one. And we followed the quiet man and saw his name come home. So here is the last secret of the night. And you have probably already guessed it, because you are sleepy and the sleepy mind sees clearly. This was always a bedtime story from the first 6 pages in 1939. That is what it was, a child's worst night, retold and retold. 10,000 times in a dozen mediums by thousands of hands until the worst night became survivable, and then noble, and then beautiful. Grown-ups never stopped needing bedtime stories. They only started calling them other things, and asked one last time the question underneath the whole night: why him? Of all the hundreds of costumed figures the 1930s gold rush stamped out, why is this the one that never once left print, never stopped being reinvented, never lost the world's attention for even a season? The Flying Man endures because we wish we were invulnerable, but the Dark Knight endures because we know we are not, and he is the myth for that knowledge. He has no powers. That is the entire secret, hiding on the surface for 80 years. Everything he is was built out of grief and discipline and stubbornness and friends, which means everything he is remains, in principle, in miniature, at human scale, available. Nobody lying awake at night can decide to be an alien. But anyone lying awake at night can decide to keep a rule. Notice a neighbor, train a skill, guard something small. He's the only great myth of his kind that is, at bottom, a set of instructions. And there's one more inheritance, quieter still, and it belongs to you personally, so take it before we bank the fire. Every person who has ever loved this story owns a piece of its upkeep. The myth survived Wortham because readers kept reading, survived cancellation because an editor kept caring, survived the ice puns because the fans kept faith through 8 dark years, and got its creator's name back because a handful of ordinary people refused to stop saying it. Myths are not kept alive by companies. They are kept alive by keepers. And tonight, for the length of one long story, you were one. The watch has been handed down to you and taken back, gently, all in one night, and the city is no worse for your shift. It is, if anything, slightly better remembered. The watchman is on the wall of this one, the way watchmen have been on walls since cities began, calling the hour. Listen, you can just about hear it under the fire. It is very late, says the call, and all is well. The bakers have the morning. The nurses have the corridors. The name is on the screen. The light is on. The case in the cave is dusted. The signal is really just a porch light, and the whole city, the real one and the imagined one, is being kept tonight by people very good at keeping. You are off the wall, little dreamer. You are relieved of watch. Let the cape fold itself over you, gray side out, soft side in, and let go of the last of the day. The way a sleeping bat lets go of everything except one effortless grip. The fire is low. The story is kept. Good night from Gotham. Good night from the rooftops and the reading lamps. Good night from 1939 and all the years since. The light is on. Someone is watching over the city. Good night.